Story 1, Chapter 17 of The Dwarf's Chamber and Other Stories by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 1, Chapter 17, Autolycus. On the Wednesday of the following week, a gruff individual in a dirty white greatcoat, with a still dirtier white hat, and a red worsted scarf, hiding most of his pimply countenance, presented himself at the Manor House, and requested to see Mr. Algernon Warwick. Likewise, continued this odd visitor, to impress the supercilious footman, the Lord. He thrust into Mercury's hand a stout piece of cardboard inscribed, Autolycus, proprietor of the rarest collection of monstrosities in the unbounded universe, and chuckled hoarsely as he conveyed further information. The collection is set up on the village green, young man, and I have known those civil to Autolycus get in on the free list. The footman did not seem to be overwhelmed by this offer, but, still supercilious, departed, holding the card betwixt a dainty finger and thumb. During his absence the showman took a seat, and, breathing hard the while, examined the stately hall in which he found himself. Autolycus had been in too many cathedral towns to be impressed by the beauty of this interior, and in place of admiring the arched roof and lofty pillars and checkered marble floor, he sighed to think that amid these splendours Warwick would soon forget the rarest collection in the unbounded universe. Such a fiddler as he was, ruminated Autolycus, solacing himself with a peppermint drop. He danced the public in, even if they didn't want to go. He's a rum start this year. I wonder how he flew so high. I'll have said he was a heagle. His further reflections were put to an end by the footman's return, and he learned that both Lord Lelanro and Warwick waited him in the library. Autolycus stumped bravely after the still scornful domestic. Before he advanced into the room, he marked his disapprobation of this conduct by making a speech, short and to the point. Instead of being a deadhead, young man, I'll charge double for your admission. No sniffers are allowed in my show. He might have added more, but that Mercury, having announced him, withdrew promptly from such low company, and Autolycus found his hand in the warm grasp of Warwick. I am glad to see you, Autolycus, said the young man heartily. Let me introduce you to Lord Lelanro, who is anxious to make your acquaintance. I allus said you were a heagle, murmured Autolycus, taking in the improved looks of his friend, and you've soared wonderful. Ah, Lord, he added, turning to Lelanro, I hope as I sees you well. I am quite well, Mr. Autolycus, and I am glad to see you. No handle to my name, Lord, said the showman, taking a seat. I got it out of a play of Mr. Shakespeare, as you may have heard on. There was no Mr. there, so I don't hold to tacking it on here. Well, Algernon Warwick, you have growed, he added, turning to the youth. Why, you could make a dozen of your parent, that is— Here Autolycus closed his mouth and winked mysteriously at Warwick, to know if he could speak openly. The secretary soon reassured him on that point. Lord Lelanro knows all my story, Autolycus, he said quickly. I told him of my father, the dwarf, and of your kindness to me. Oh, that wasn't much, Algernon. I couldn't see a bright lad like you sink when 'twas your nature to soar. A heagle, I said, always a heagle. Well, Lord, I've come with the whole show. It's down at the village under charge of the missus. I must go and see my old friend, Mrs. Gus. Mrs. Gus, repeated Lelanro, wondering why the wife's name was different to that of the husband. Your better half, Autolycus? She thinks herself the better whole, growled the showman, who was evidently under petticoat government. My name, Lord, is Gus, but I call myself professionally Autolycus. She, well known to the public as the Bodine Sylph, now answers to the private name of Mrs. Gus. I understand, said Lelanro, smiling. Mr. Warwick, I think you may go down to the village and renew your acquaintance with Mrs. Gus. I wish to speak with this gentleman alone. Certainly, my lord, answered Warwick, wondering what could be the reason of all this mystery. I will go at once. "And pray, Mr. Warwick, request Dr. Pryce to give me the pleasure of his company," pursued Lelanro, accompanying his secretary to the door. "I will give you my reasons in a few days," he added in a lower tone, noting the young man's wonder. "You can trust me, Mr. Warwick." "I should be ungrateful if I did not," replied Warwick, taking the hand held out to him. "I leave myself in your hands." When the door closed behind him, Lelanro returned to his seat and looked with some interest on Autolycus, who, unused to high society, strove to hide his confusion by another peppermint drop. "You wonder, no doubt, why I have sent for you, Autolycus," said Lelanro slowly. "But the fact is, Mr. Warwick arrived at my house some time ago, and as I have taken a great fancy to him, I made him my secretary." "A heagle, lord, that's what he is." "Mr. Warwick told me his story," pursued Lelanro, smiling at the remark, "and I notice that there is a mystery connected with his birth." Before Autolycus could remark on this speech, Pryce entered the room, and having been duly presented to the showman, took a seat beside Lelanro to assist at extracting information regarding Warwick. "I should like you to tell us, Autolycus," said Lelanro, when the introduction was over, "what you know of Mr. Warwick." Autolycus wiped his countenance with a red bandana handkerchief, and looked sharply at the two men before him. In spite of his eccentricities, he was no fool, and liked Warwick too well to make any revelation which, for all he knew, might be hurtful to his future. "First, lord and doctor," said the showman, placing a stumpy forefinger in the palm of his left hand, "I'd like to know your game." The reply to this leading question required some consideration. Lelanro was by no means inclined to trust this man of the people with the secret of his house, and so he framed a cautious answer, which, while satisfying the scruples of Autolycus, yet preserved the dignity of the Lelanros. "I design no ill to Mr. Warwick," said he, after a pause. "On the contrary, I wish to do my best to advance his interests. But you must be aware, Autolycus, since it pleases you to be called so, that unless I know all about the youth, I cannot hope to assist him as I should wish." "That's fair enough, lord," answered Autolycus, revolving this reply. "I can tell you all I know, for there ain't anything as is best to hide. You know his story, I believe." "We know that his father was a dwarf, who married the fair Circassian, and that he was sent to public school at your insistence," said Pryce. "That was a good deed of yours, Autolycus." "Nothin', lord and doctor. I said he was a heagle to sore, and wanted to help him. Not but what I was sorry to lose him, sirs. What a fiddler he is!" "He plays the violin excellently," said Lelanro impatiently. "But about his father. Where did you obtain this dwarf?" "Ah, that's Algernon the Pygmy Napoleon. So we called him professionally, lord and doctor. Aye, he was a draw. I never saw a freak like him. Beautifully made he was, and could have gone into a teacup." "Where did you get him?" "I got him," repeated Autolycus slowly, "from a man called Ballard. But where he got him, I don't know." Pryce and Lelanro looked at one another, and seemed to approve of this speech. "In what year did you receive this dwarf from Ballard?" asked Lelanro anxiously. "It was in 1849, replied Autolycus, scratching his head. "Leastway, I think so, 'cause I lost money at Rochester that year, and the next Algernon pulled it back for me. Ah, lord and doctor, he was a draw, that Pygmy Napoleon." "Warwick has a paper given him by his father," said Pryce, "in which the date of his birth—" "Of whose birth, doctor? Algernon 1 or Algernon 2? "The first, the father." "This paper says he was born in 1857. So that being the case, you couldn't have received him in 1849, before he was born." "Oh, that's nothing, sir," said Autolycus contemptuously. "The Pygmy Napoleon, you must know, gentlemen, was always thinking himself a great person and descended from crowned heads. He believed in that paper, which he said came from Ballard, who sometimes came to see how he was. But it didn't mean much. He said that the figures and the letters of the name Algernon, which was his own, would prove his rank, but he never could find out the meaning, and the Ballard wouldn't tell him. From what I know," added Autolycus emphatically, "he was born in 1846, for I got him in 1849, and he was then 3 years old. To be sure, I ain't certain of his real age. He might have been 2 when I got him. These dwarfs are so misleading from their smallness." "Then how do you account for the 11 years' difference inscribed on that paper?" asked Lelanro. "It was a riddle, sir. Leastways Ballard said so, and I guess he altered the figures from 4 to 5 to suit the finding out of it." Lord Lelanro nodded to imply that the explanation satisfied him, and made 2 or 3 memoranda on a slip of paper. Then he asked another question. "Did this man Ballard give you any explanation as to how he came by the dwarf?" "No, he didn't," retorted the showman gruffly. "He was as deep as a well, and told me to mind my own business. He had a share in Algernon." "A share?" "Yes, lord. I gave him so much on the takings, for the pigmy Napoleon was a great draw with the public. Now he's dead, and the rest of the show don't attract like he did. I wish Ballard could have got me another dwarf like him. I'd give him the same price, I would." "Don't talk like that, man," said Lelanro, who looked rather pale. "I don't want to hear these details." Autolycus, rather wondering at this unaccountable agitation, took another peppermint drop, and, being wise in his generation, held his peace. "Ballard is dead, is he not?" asked Pryce, seeing the old nobleman was too upset to speak. "My doctor, I didn't know it when I told young Algernon to go to London for the second time, but when I wrote to that Ballard in Duke Street a month ago, I found out he was dead. Died in furrin parts, gentlemen, as a valet to a travelling gent." "Where was this dwarf of yours married to the fair Circassian?" "In St. Martin's Church, Canterbury," replied the showman. "Oh, it was all straight, lord. I wouldn't have profligacy in my caravan. Neither would the missus. She's very, very moral, she is," concluded Autolycus, shaking his head. "As moral a boudin sylph as I ever did see." "Have you a picture of this dwarf?" demanded Lelanro, making another memorandum. "I brought one with me, as I guessed from young Algernon's letter you wanted to see me about his father," replied Autolycus, producing a photograph from his pocket, and laying it down before Lelanro. "You don't happen to know, lord, where Ballard got that dwarf? I'd give a good deal to get another of 'em, male or female. My stars, he was a draw, so beautifully made, so—" "That will do, that will do," said Lelanro sharply. "Leave me for a time, Autolycus. I'll see you later on, and renew this conversation. Pryce, ring the bell." The doctor did so, and when the footman appeared, Autolycus was delivered into his charge with instructions to look after his creature comforts. Pryce conducted the showman to the door, and dismissed him with a last warning. "Not a word of this conversation to a soul," he said hurriedly. Autolycus laid a stubby finger on one side of his red nose to imply silence, and stumped out of the room in the wake of Mercury. Dr. Pryce returned to find his patron with a drawn face full of pain, leaning back in his chair. "My sin has found me out, Pryce," said Lord Lelanro with a groan. "True enough," replied Pryce coolly. "Still, you have a chance of making reparation to the son for what you did to the father." "Do you think he'll forgive me, Pryce?" "Under the circumstances," said the doctor after a pause, "I think he will forgive you. I only hope," he added rather anxiously, "that he will forgive me also, for at your request, Lord Lelanro, I misled the poor boy by a false statement." Chapter 17. Story 1, Chapter 18 of The Dwarf's Chamber and Other Stories by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 1, Chapter 18, Renunciation. Autolycus had come and gone, but it did not seem to Warwick that his visit had resulted in anything tangible. Ignorant of what had taken place in the library, he could not understand why Lord Lelanro had sought speech with the showman, and as nothing was said on the matter, he did not seek to force the confidence of either Pryce or the old nobleman. Things went on as usual after the departure of Autolycus, save that Edgar Winyard made himself more disagreeable than ever, and Celia assumed a kinder manner. Warwick could not understand the reason of her new-born geniality. After the rebuke administered by Madam Tot, her grandniece had seriously examined her mind, so as to ascertain beyond all doubt what were her feelings towards Warwick. As she might have guessed, the examination showed her that she was hopelessly in love with the young man, and as that love, according to Madam Tot, was ardently returned, Celia foresaw for herself and him a very unhappy future. As Celia, she could not be happy without the love and companionship of Warwick. As Miss Lelanro, it was out of the question that she should attain such blessings through the medium of so imprudent a marriage. She was the daughter of a noble house, he a nameless orphan, penniless and obscure. It were less difficult to join fire and water than these two in holy matrimony, yet in such junction lay the future happiness of each. Edgar, with the keen eyes of a jealous lover, guessed the feelings of his cousin towards Warwick, and hated them both accordingly, Celia for her weakness, Warwick for his insolent aspirations. Greatly as he would have liked to end the matter by ridding the house of Warwick, such a course was out of the question while the young man remained the favourite of Lelanro. Once or twice, indeed, Winyard had hinted at the lad's presumption, but the old lord persistently refused to believe that his protégé could do anything wrong, and told Edgar plainly to leave such matters alone. Celia also had reproved him sharply for remarks made in the same spirit, so Edgar could do nothing but look on hopelessly and wrathfully at this interloper assuming his place in the household. With the petty spite of a narrow understanding, he lost no opportunity of rousing Warwick's temper, but his malice was thwarted by the supreme disdain manifested by the young man. Even Winyard's thick hide of egotism was stung by this calm contempt. Though Warwick held his own bravely, and strove by masking his emotions to keep things smooth, yet he was very unhappy, and thinking Celia was beyond his reach, he resolved to end his folly by absenting himself from her presence. It was truly the desire of the moth for the star, but in this instance the star had stooped of late to the lowly sphere of the moth, and it was this point that most troubled the unhappy lover. As an honourable man, he could not win clandestinely the love of his patron's granddaughter. Sometimes he had it in his mind to throw himself at her feet and implore her compassion, but a constant memory of Lelanro's kindness prevented such folly, and in the effort to preserve his honour he was the more disdainful of the two. These lovers were working at cross purposes, and consequently they felt daily more unhappy, a state of things not ameliorated by the watchful hatred of the inconvenient third. Madam Tot was well aware of Warwick's passion for her great niece, but notwithstanding her pride, which was great, she did not seek to discourage the wooing. Nay, more, on all possible occasions she brought the couple together in her garden, and by looks and hints she seemed to desire to bring about an understanding. Celia, who by this time had thrown prudence to the winds, was in no wise disinclined to bring matters to a crisis, but Warwick, with a strength of will far beyond his years, did his best to withstand temptation. At length the effort became too great, and he sought Lelanro in order to confess his unhappy feelings, and ask permission to withdraw from so dangerous a neighbourhood. Had this resolution been made known to Madam Tot, she would have been greatly offended, as she desired Warwick to remain till she solved his riddle by the fairy ring when the moon was full. He, however, anticipating no benefit from her revelation, was impatient of her whimsical fancy to blend the real with the ideal, mortal doings with fairy fancy, and with youthful impetuosity he poured out his heart to Lelanro, with a final request that he might leave without delay. Strange as it may appear, the haughty old nobleman did not seem angered at Warwick's presumption in loving Celia, but heard him to the end with a benign smile. "And you are resolved to leave me," he said, when the lad ended with hanging head and flushed cheek. "I must, my lord. It is torture for me to stay here, and no good can come of a hopeless passion." "No, that is very true," replied Lelanro smoothly. "The disparity between your ranks renders marriage impossible." "I suppose so. But I am not to blame for loving her. King Cophetua loved a beggar maid, my lord. This passion of mine is the reverse." "It is honourable of you to tell me this," said Lelanro gravely, "but you must know that I can only answer in one way." "I am aware of that, my lord," replied Warwick bitterly. "I never blinded myself to the real aspect of the affair. The desire of the moth for the star. The moth must go, and the star—" "What of the star?" "Will wed another who is not worthy of her." "If you mean Mr. Winyard," said Lelanro quietly, "I can disabuse your mind on that score. Celia does not love him. I do not respect him, so she will never become his wife." "Ah," sighed Warwick, drawing a long breath, "if only I had rank and position to offer there might be a chance for me." "Do you think rank and position would weigh with Celia, then?" "I don't know. I have not spoken," stammered Warwick, rather startled by so direct a question. "But yourself, my lord?" "We will talk of that another time," said the old gentleman with a dry cough. "In the meantime, I observe you have not asked me concerning my interview with Autolycus. Did you learn anything from him, my lord?" "Well, yes. I learned something of your family." Warwick turned pale, for the idea that he would at last know who and what he was seemed too good to be true. "My family?" he gasped, with a quick indrawn breath. Did Autolycus know?" "He knew something. Dr. Pryce and myself knew the rest." "But what can you know about me?" cried Warwick in despair. "Do not raise my hopes only to dash them to the ground." "No, no, my boy, I shall not do that," said Lelanro, laying a kind hand on his shoulder. "I would tell you the truth now, but that I promised my poor little sister the joy of breaking the news to you. She is so proud of that riddle." "The riddle?" "Precisely. She has solved the riddle, which was an easy matter to her. Why, she will tell you herself. You have had many strange adventures, Mr. Warwick, but the most wonderful is yet to come. To night you shall hear the truth." "Hear, my lord?" "No, I told you of my promise to my sister. The poor little creature, as you know, Mr. Warwick, is fond of designating herself a changeling, and in her own imagination participates in fairy revels. To night, as the moon is full, she indulges in this freak, and then intends to let you know the truth. Afterwards you will come to Pryce's study and see me." "But, my lord, it is too serious a matter to me to—" "To be mixed up with the follies of Madam Tot, you would say?" said Lelanro quickly. "Perhaps it is. But as she made the first discovery, it is only right that she should have the pleasure of communicating it at first hand. And after all, Mr. Warwick," concluded the old man pathetically, "you surely do not grudge this trifling pleasure to so afflicted a creature. Be kind to her for my sake." "Let it be as you will, my lord," said Warwick, taking the hand held out to him. "I am quite agreeable to be informed as Madam Tot pleases. But when I know the truth, will I stay or go?" "I shall leave that to you, sir," said Lelanro, smiling. "It depends on yourself." "Or on Miss Lelanro," hinted Warwick, with a daring which astonished himself. "In that case," said the old lord, pausing a moment at the door, "you had better speak to Miss Lelanro herself." And with that significant observation he passed out of the room, leaving Warwick too surprised to make a remark. Left alone, he sank into a chair and strove to collect his scattered senses, which the concluding speech of Lelanro had dispersed to the four winds of heaven. That so proud a man as his patron should actually encourage him to woo Celia seemed inexplicable. The only solution lay in the fact that Lelanro must be satisfied that the race whence he sprang was equal to his own. Again Warwick thought of the possibility of his father being one of the Lelanro dwarfs, and himself heir to the estates, but this idea vanished when he thought of the tiny grave with the date on the headstone. In the face of such evidence, all chance of his hopes proving true was at an end, and he reluctantly dismissed the thought that he was a Lelanro. Yet if the grave was strong evidence on the one side, the fact that his father had been a dwarf was strong evidence on the other, for it was impossible that so curious a circumstance could be a mere coincidence. Warwick at length grew so bewildered that he did not know what to think, and decided to leave the matter to time. "Whether I be a Lelanro or not," said he hopefully, "from what my lord says, I am certainly of sufficiently good birth to aspire to the hand of Celia. That is sufficient for me, and I ask no more of Providence." End of chapter 18. Story 1, Chapter 19 of The Dwarf's Chamber and Other Stories by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 1, Chapter 19, Fairy Music. That same evening Wynyard, undeterred by the memory of former refusals, proposed to Cecilia for the third time. Aware of his pertinacious disposition, and having some inkling of his intention, she had hitherto managed to evade an interview. But now, finding herself alone with him in the drawing-room after dinner, she submitted to her fate. Yet had not Edgar been blinded by self-conceit, he might have guessed what would be the result of his ill-advised application. "Cousin Edgar," said she, after he had solemnly asked her to be his wife, "I am very sorry that you should still hope for the impossible. Twice I have refused you, and I do so now for the third time." "But think of the advantages of our marrying," urged Edgar anxiously. "I will be Lord Lelanro within a measurable time, and own this property, so it is better for you to become my wife than to lose your home at the Manor House." "I would rather lose it than take you with it, cousin," retorted Celia sharply. "I wish to marry no one at present, least of all you." "But I love you, Celia." "I am sorry to hear it. For once and for all I refuse to become your wife." Edgar, tracing in this contemptuous refusal the influence of Warwick, lost his temper, and made thoughtless remarks about Celia and the secretary, which roused her wrath. "You love that sneaking Warwick, Celia," he cried savagely, "and would be willing enough to marry him if he asked you. But you shall not marry him. I'll have him turned out of the house." "That will be your own fate if you speak like this," said Celia, rising to her feet with a glowing cheek. "Mr. Warwick is my very good friend, nothing more. If he is poor and unknown, he is at least a gentleman, which I regret to say you are not." And without further speech she turned her back on the discomfited lover and walked towards the door. Enraged at her scorn, Edgar sped one last venomed shaft. "You are going to meet the fellow now, I believe." "Yes, I am," replied Celia, with supreme disdain. "Mr. Warwick is at present in the company of Madam Tot, and I am going to see them both. If you choose, you can employ your time in telling my grandfather." Her cousin could find nothing to reply to this last remark, and so permitted her to leave the room without further speech. Left to himself, he raged impotently at the thought that he could do no harm to this interloper, and at length, losing all sense of wisdom in his hatred, he went in search of Lelanro, in order to insist upon the instant dismissal of the presumptuous secretary. His interference benefited in place of harming Warwick, and, by the irony of fate, Edgar Wynyard, who of all men would have declined the task, was the means of restoring the man he hated to his rightful position in the world. It was the night of the full moon, and Madam Tot, enamoured of her whimsical idea, had summoned Warwick to the elfin solemnities at the Fairy Ring. This, as has been stated previously, was a circle of discoloured grass, which to her distempered fancy was haunted by the peaceful neighbours. Whether she suffered from hallucination, or whether she pretended to see her airy fancies embodied in actual forms, it is impossible to say, but she certainly described what was taking place to Warwick with a vividness which almost enabled him to behold the fantasy with his own eyes. On the plea that the little people did not like a mortal to espy on their solemnities, she made Warwick sit down on the bench encircling the elm tree near the summer house, and, hidden in the shade, he looked out on the moonlit sward over which moved fantastically the tiny figure of Madam Tot. As a compliment to the fairies, she had assumed her favourite green colour, and with a crown of roses and her ebony staff held wand fashion, she looked like an actual inhabitant of Elfland. Titania was not more graceful, Puck more impish, or Queen Mab more airy than this odd little dwarf skipping about the lawn to the music of the violin. "Do you not see the little people?" said she, running into the shade, "yonder in the cold moonlight? They whirl round and round in a ring with linked hands and flying hair. The green urchin, bonneted with a purple Canterbury bell, is Oberon's lantern-bearer. That pale fairy in filmy white is the Queen of Spring Flowers, as you can tell by her snowdrop crown. And oh, piped Madam Tot, clapping her hands, just look at yonder red goblin with the grey beard and pointed cap. My dear, he is a gnome, and digs gold in haunted caverns to weld into fairy rings." "Ask him to bring me one," said Warwick, marvelling at the descriptive power of the little woman, which almost made him credit her fancies. "I spoke of it some time back," replied Madam Tot in a matter-of-fact tone, as though the procuring of fairy rings was quite an ordinary business. "He will bring you to-night a wedding ring." "A wedding ring, Madam Tot?" "Yes, my dear, a ring of red gold to bind you hard and fast to a fair lady." "Who is the lady?" asked Warwick, divining some purpose in these foolish speeches. For answer, Madam Tot whirled herself in a magical manner, and while thus revolving, shrilled out, "Come together, ne'er to part, hand to hand and heart to heart." "You see, Man Mountain," she added, dropping into prose, "I call and she comes. Never deny that I am a witch." Across the sward came Celia, looking pale and serious, for the late interview with Edgar had somewhat disturbed her equanimity. The cunning dwarf had caught a glimpse of her emerging from the house, and thus utilized the opportune arrival for the fulfilment of the prophecy. With the moonlight glinting on her russet hair, Celia, in her white robe, looked like a visitant from another world, and Warwick could not remove his eyes from her passionless loveliness. Saluting her with an elfish scream, Madam Tot danced up to her like a large doll. "I bid you welcome to the festival," said she, striving to reach Celia's hand. "It is by special permission of the neighbours of peace that you are here. To-night they will bestow on you a rare boon. Take your place, my love, and watch." With due solemnity she conducted Celia to the bench, and intimated that she should sit beside Warwick. Rather confused by the request, Celia obeyed in silence, and was glad to think that the shadows hid the blushes she felt rising hotly to her cheeks. The young man, overcome with pleasure at her near neighbourhood, did not venture a remark, and so these two sane people waited the behests of the mad dwarf lady. "Play!" cried Madam Tot, raising her hand. "I dance with my shadow." Warwick swept the bow across the strings, and a ripple of notes gushed forth. With a gasp of pure pleasure, the dwarf sprang from shadow to light, and holding up her quaint green dress, footed it as merrily as though she were 16 instead of 60. She swayed and swung and whirled and bowed with waving hands and nimble feet, till Celia almost fancied she saw a tiny witch at some Lilliputian Walpurgis night. With beck and bend she coquetted with her shadow, kissed her tiny hands as it wavered on the sward, fled from it, pursued it, and spun in circles after its retreating blackness. The music rose and fell, rippled through the still air, and laughed and sang till one would have said the violin was as elfish a thing as Madam Tot herself. Suddenly she whirled towards the fairy ring, and sank in a heap in its centre. Warwick hastily laid down his violin and rose as to help her, but she angrily called to him to keep back. "You will break the spell," she cried shrilly. "I now listen to the dwarfs who bring your marriage ring from the subterranean caves." So speaking, she laid her ear to the turf, while Warwick and Celia, in the deep shadow of the tree, looked at one another, bubbling with silent laughter. The oddity of the whole situation appealed to the romantic side of their natures, but knowing the irritable nature of Madam Tot, they did not dare to show disrespect by giving vent to their secret feelings of amusement. "Do you think she sees anything really?" asked Celia in a low whisper. "She may have hallucinations," replied Warwick in the same tone, "and I think her imagination is vivid enough to conjure up all the elves of England. Poor little thing!" he sighed sympathetically. "It is a harmless pleasure in which she indulges." "You seem very fond of Madam Tot, Mr. Warwick." "She is a quaint, lovable little creature," he answered softly. "I will be sorry to leave her." "But you are not going?" said Celia with dismay. "I must. As soon as I learn the meaning of the riddle, I go," replied the young man firmly. "It is better for my peace of mind." But think how I shall miss you," gasped Celia imprudently. Whether it was the influence of the moonlight, the music, or the whole fantasy of the scene, Warwick did not know, but almost without thinking he enclosed Celia's hands in his warm clasp. "Would you miss me, Miss Lelanro, Celia?" "Can you ask me that?" she replied reproachfully. "I would miss you more than any one in the world." "But, Celia, I am poor and unknown. Oh, it's impossible. I dare not." "Then you do not love me?" "I do love you, fondly, passionately. But oh, Celia, have mercy on my folly." He slid off the bench to the ground, and looked up to her with enamoured eyes. She, having passed the Rubicon, forgot that she was Miss Lelanro, and he a servitor of her grandfather. She forgot social laws, social barriers, and only feeling in her own heart that she loved him above all men, bent down and kissed him softly on the forehead. "Do you mean it?" he asked, hardly able to believe that his goddess had stooped from her sphere. "Do you wish me to kiss you again, to prove that I do?" she replied, smiling through the gloom. "I do mean it. I love you." "And I He rose to his feet, unable to articulate another word, and clasped her in his arms. In the warm gloom, heart beating on heart, lips laid to lips, they forgot the barrier of caste and prejudice. It fell, they came together, and knew that they loved, they adored each other. Youth and beauty and passion proved too strong for social laws. Rash, foolish as it was, the knowledge had come to them in its full strength. They loved. An elvish titter made them spring apart, and they looked down to see Madam Tot close beside them. But no frown was on her face, and instead of appearing to be angry, she expressed her pleasure loudly. "Things have turned out well," she said, smiling. "You will marry one another, and become Lord and Lady of Lelanro Manor." "How can that be?" asked Warwick in surprise. "The riddle—" "No interruption," frowned Madam Tot, holding out her hand. "Here is the fairy ring which the gnomes have brought for your wedding. Place it on Celia's finger, and then I read your riddle." The ring she proffered, wherever it came from, was certainly tangible enough, and Warwick, hardly knowing what he was about, slipped it on the slim finger held out by Celia. She was smiling, and seemed to understand her great aunt better than did Warwick, who was too bewildered to speak. "That fairy circle binds you together for ever and ever," said the dwarf solemnly. "Our solemnities are at an end, and I return to the actual world. In the study of Dr. Pryce my brother awaits you, so lead your bride thither, Algernon Lelanro." "What name did you say?" cried Warwick, hardly crediting his ears, and looking from the dwarf to Celia. "You are Algernon Lelanro," said the latter, smiling, "and I am your cousin Celia. Foolish boy, I knew it well, else I never would have listened to your wooing." Chapter 19. Story 1, Chapter 20 of The Dwarf's Chamber and Other Stories by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 1, Chapter 20, Algernon, 24 December, 1857. In the study, the three who entered found a waiting three. Beside the desk sat Lord Lelanro, looking proud and happy, yet with a glint of uneasiness in his eyes as they turned toward Warwick. Dr. Pryce, shifting some papers, bent beside him, and some few paces beyond, Edgar Winyard, looking anxious and expectant, leaned against the wall. The trio were evidently awaiting the arrival of Madam Tot and the newly pledged lovers. Into the warmth and mellow light of the room came Warwick, with Celia on his arm, but so moved was he by the communication of his kinship with the Lelanros that he stood stock still at the door, gazing open-mouthed at those who waited. Celia touched his arm softly to intimate that he should advance, but finding the hint unheeded, she led him forward to where her grandfather sat in the great chair. Madam Tot, blithe as a lark, acted as mistress of ceremonies. "Brother," she said, looking up at the head of the family, "all has gone as you wished. They have plighted their faith to one another, and on her finger gleams the ring of fairy gold. He," she added, pointing an emphatic forefinger at Warwick, "now knows that he is your grandson, my grand-nephew, and heir to the title and estates of the Lelanros. He—" With an exclamation of rage and astonishment, Winyard started forward to interrupt the explanation of the dwarf. "What foolery is this?" said he, directly addressing his kinsman. "Why does that malicious monkey call that fellow your grandson and heir?" "Because it is the truth, sir," replied Lelanro haughtily, "and I advise you to be more careful of your expressions in speaking of my sister." "No matter, brother, no matter," tittered Madam Tot with a malignant smile. "I can listen now to his coarse tongue. Through me he has lost title and lands." She nodded with great satisfaction, and was rewarded with a black scowl from Winyard, who began to think that after all there might be truth in her speeches. By this time Warwick, who, out of sheer bewilderment, hitherto had kept silent, recovered his tongue and advanced impetuously towards Lelanro. "What is the meaning of this, my lord?" he demanded anxiously. "Is it a jest to amuse Madam Tot?" "It is the truth, Algernon," replied Lelanro, addressing the young man for the first time by his name. "You are indeed my grandson, the offspring of my dwarfish son." "But that son died," stammered Warwick, looking at Pryce. "I saw his grave." "That is true enough," answered Pryce, lifting his head. "You saw his grave, but that grave was empty. Albert Lelanro, who resembled that little creature, was not buried there, but was taken away by Ballard and given to Autolycus. He, and not the father of Miss Celia, was the heir to the estates. You, as his son, inherit his rights and will succeed to my lord. The grave was made and the tombstone erected to avert unnecessary questions." "It's a lie!" cried Edgar, bringing his fist down on the table. "It is the truth," retorted Pryce, in as assertive a tone. "If you doubt me, ask your cousin." He pointed to Lord Lelanro, and Edgar would have immediately questioned him as to the rights of Pryce's assertion, when Madam Tot, unused to neglect, bustled forward and claimed the attention of the company. "Lift me up on that chair," she said to Warwick in a peremptory tone, "and look over my shoulder. I will now explain to you the riddle, and show you how to make Lelanro out of Algernon." Burning with curiosity, Warwick lifted her into the seat, and looked at the paper which she spread out on the table. Edgar also came closer, in order to see if there was truth in these unpleasant declarations which robbed him of his expected heirship. Only Celia, her grandfather, and Dr. Pryce held aloof. They knew well the reading of the riddle, and did not require to assist at the explanation. With the two young men looking down at that fatal piece of paper, Madam Tot, delighted at the prominent position she now occupied, deftly unravelled the riddle which had perplexed Warwick for so long. "You wonder, perhaps, why I guessed this the moment you gave it to me," said the dwarf, with an upward glance at Warwick. "But I would not have done it so quickly had I not invented the riddle myself." You invented it, Madam Tot? Yes. You know I am fond of such things, replied the little lady, enjoying his wonder. I invented, or rather selected this name, which by transposing the letters contains our family title, Lelanro. But how do you know which letters to transpose? Asked Warwick curiously. I take the figures of the date of birth, and place the letters in that order, said Madam Tot complacently. It is true that your father was born on the 24th of December, 1847, so to make the letters transpose rightly, I was forced to add 10 years to that date, and bring it up to 1857. Then my father was 43 when he died? Cried Warwick, noting the figures. You surely did not go by this paper and think he was 33, did you? Said the dwarf contemptuously. In that case, according to your age, you were born when your father was only 11 years of age, instead of which, at the date of your birth, he was rightfully 21. That in itself is quite sufficient to show the falsity of the whole thing, said Winyard savagely. Nothing of the sort, Mr. Winyard, retorted Warwick promptly. I did not know my father's age, neither did he. Foolishly enough he believed this paper to be true, but as he was a dwarf, and scarcely so keen-witted as other folk, you can hardly blame him. I saw the flaw of which Madam Tot speaks long ago, and it was that which made me doubt whether the truth was to be found on this paper. I am not so foolish, added Warwick indignantly, as not to know that this is 1890, and that if my father had been born in 1857, I could not possibly be his son. Well, you see the explanation, said Madam Tot quickly. Your father was born in 1847, and you when he was 21 years of age. I see that, but how do you transpose the letters? Madam Tot placed before him a piece of paper, on which was written the name Algernon, and the date 24 December, 1857. Read that as Algernon 24/12/1857, she said, substituting the 12th month for December. Now run all the figures together without division, and they read 24121,857. Now, Mr. Warwick, how many numbers are there? 8. Good. And how many letters are there in the name Algernon? 8. Good. And in the name Lelanro, going by the old way of spelling it? 8. Quite right, said Madam Tot, delighted at the way in which he followed her explanation. Now I apply the figures to the letters. The first number is 2. What is the second letter of the name Algernon? L. Yes. The second figure is 4. What is the fourth letter of the name? E. There you are, Mr. Warwick, L-E. Now, the first letter A, the second again L, the first once more A, the eighth N, the fifth R, and the seventh O. Now, what does the whole spell? Lelanro. Of course, which is the old spelling of our name, Lelanro, cried Madam Tot, clapping her hands. I invented the name Algernon out of it by adding 10 years to the birth, as you see. Ballard found the paper in my chamber, and I have no doubt he gave it to your father, quite ignorant of the hidden meaning. Warwick could not sufficiently admire the ingenuity of the dwarf, and complimented her highly, at which she was much gratified. Then it was true that his name was Lelanro, and that he was the grandson of his patron. With a flush of joy overspreading his face, he advanced towards his grandfather and held out his hand. I am grateful, sir, that you have restored to me my name and rank, he said in a voice of emotion, but I can never be sufficiently grateful for your kindness when I was a poor and unknown wanderer. I do not believe a word of all this rubbish, broke out Winyard, before Lord Lelanro could reply, and I shall not submit to be robbed of my rights in this manner. I shall go to law over it. You will do no such thing, sir, retorted the old lord in a stern tone, which quelled the fiery anger of the young man. This is a family matter, and must be settled here. Not a word must be breathed outside these walls. Why so? Demanded Edgar insolently. Because the father of that lad was a dwarf, said Lelanro, pointing to Warwick. Do you think for a moment that I will let you take this matter before the House of Lords, and permit the secret of our family to be known? Never. You will abandon all claims to my title and estate, and receive instead a yearly income to be fixed by me." "And if I refuse?" "You dare not refuse," replied Lelanro in a dangerously quiet tone. "If you did question the rights of your cousin, and shame our family by betraying the secret of the dwarf's chamber, you would gain nothing but beggary. The proofs which make Algernon Warwick the heir are too strong to be controverted. Show him the papers, Pryce, and let him decide at once what course he intends to take." Edgar turned sullenly towards Pryce, who spread out the papers for his inspection. "The first," said he, "is a certificate of the birth of Albert Lelanro, a dwarf, given by my predecessor, Dr. Gulder, in 1847. The next, a confession by Walter Ballard, stating that he took the dwarf from here by order of my lord, and disposed of him to one George Guss, a showman commonly known as Autolycus. The third is a statement by Autolycus, stating that he received the dwarf Albert Lelanro from Ballard, and called him Algernon from that paper so often referred to. Here is also the certificate of Albert Lelanro's marriage at the Church of St. Martin in Canterbury, with Emily Marby, commonly known as the Fair Circassian. Again, the certificate of birth date, 1868, of Algernon Lelanro, now known as Algernon Warwick, and finally an affidavit sworn by Autolycus that Algernon Warwick is the son of the dwarf Albert Lelanro. You will see, Mr. Winyard, that not a link is missing, and that our friend Warwick is really and truly the grandson of your kinsman, Lord Lelanro." Winyard could not deny that the proofs were plain enough, and stood sullenly looking at his successful rival. Madam Tot clapped her hands with glee at the solution of the mystery which had perplexed Warwick for so long, and then the latter spoke. "How is it that Ballard took away my father from this place?" he said, looking at Lord Lelanro with eager curiosity. The old man flushed with shame, and he hung his head before the gaze of his grandson. "That was my fault," he said in a low voice, "and one for which I must ask your pardon. Albert, your father, was my eldest son, but when he was pronounced a dwarf, I could not bear the idea that he should succeed to the title and estates which were rightfully his, nor did I think it wise that he should be kept in the dwarf's chamber, lest he should be discovered by accident, and in after years, on learning the truth, might insist on his rights. I therefore gave him to Ballard to take away, and this was done. I did not intend to lose sight of him, but Ballard disappeared, and I could not trace him. Then my second son, Celia's father, was born, and I thought myself sure of a successor. But he was killed, and my sin was brought home to me, for then there was no one but Edgar to inherit. I tried to find out what had become of the dwarf Albert, but could not discover a trace of him. Then you appeared opportunely, and when you told your story, I thought that the dwarf father you mentioned might be my son. Aided by Pryce, I went to work, and learned all you have heard, but the truth might have remained undiscovered had not the landlady of the Lelanro Arms brought to Dr. Pryce her brother's confession." "That was why Mistress Sally was in this study on that night." "Yes," said Dr. Pryce, taking up the story. "She did not guess the truth, being in ignorance of your story. But the question you put to her on that day made her fearful of keeping the confession of her brother any longer, so she brought it to me. It was then that Lord Lelanro and myself knew that you were none other than the heir." "But you told me that Albert Lelanro was dead," said Warwick reproachfully. "Yes, at the request of Lord Lelanro," said Pryce rather shamefacedly. "You must forgive me for that." "I did not want you to know the truth till I had proved you," said Lelanro quickly. "Had you been a boor, an untutored clown, I might have held my peace. But when I saw you so clever, so well bred, so handsome, in a word, so well fitted to be my heir, I determined to reinstate you in your rightful position. I have erred, Algernon," he added, looking steadily at his grandson, "but it was for the honour of the family, and you must forgive me." Warwick held out his hand, too delighted at his good fortune to bear malice at such a moment. "I do forgive you, and Pryce also," he said heartily. I would indeed be ungrateful did I withhold forgiveness after all your kindness to me." The old lord took the lad's hand and placed it in that of Celia. "This, perhaps, will seal your forgiveness," he said with a smile. Edgar cast one look of hatred at the lovers and fled from the room, pursued by the mocking laughter of the dwarf. End of chapter 20. Story 1, Chapter 21 of The Dwarf's Chamber and Other Stories by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 1, Chapter 21. An Important Communication. About 2 years after the events heretofore recorded, Warwick, as Celia continued to call him, had occasion to write to his grandfather, who was then in Paris. "I regret to hear," he wrote among other things, "that Winyard is dead. He did not live long to enjoy the income you so kindly allowed him, and I am afraid it was my succession to his place of your heir that induced him to take to the dissipated courses which have now terminated in his death by his own hand. But if you, my dear grandfather, write about the end of one life, I have information to impart concerning the beginning of another. Celia has just confided to me that she trusts shortly to become a mother, and I am in great hopes that it will be a son, so that the direct succession may be secured. As is natural, I cannot help wondering if I shall be the father of a dwarf. My father was one, as you know, so it is not improbable that the hereditary taint will reappear in the person of my son or daughter. I trust that this will not be so, and that it may be many a long day before the dwarf's chamber is provided with another tenant. Still, I am anxious, and I shall continue to be so until the matter is proved otherwise. Several times I have consulted with Pryce, but medical science can give us no aid. Some taint in our blood induces the reappearance of these extraordinary beings at irregular intervals, but Pryce suggests that, as your generation produced Madam Tot, and the succeeding one my father, it is not improbable that, my own generation being free, the next one may be the same. How thankful both I and Celia shall be if our expected child proves to be free from this terrible curse. So terrible does it seem to me that I often question whether it was wise for you to lift me from my obscurity and let me marry Celia. If Winyard had succeeded to the estates, being a distant relation, the taint might have disappeared in his children, but Celia and myself being in the direct line, I dread the worse. This being the case, I should like you to come back at your earliest convenience in order to discuss the matter. If a dwarf is born, are we justified in shutting up the unfortunate creature in the chamber? It seems to me to be rather cruel, for though Madam Tot appears to be happy and content, yet she pines at times for a breath of the outer world. Again, if our dwarfs were ugly monstrosities, I could understand the reason for their seclusion, but they are so perfectly made, so intelligent, so attractive in every sense of the word, that beyond the fact of their tiny size, I see no reason why our family should not openly avow their existence. This point will bear a great deal of discussion, though perhaps it may not be raised, as there is no use anticipating trouble, and the future generation may be free from the taint. During your absence I have amused myself by writing a record of my adventures from the time I arrived, footsore and hungry, at Dalesford. It is astonishing how interesting they prove to be, for the whole circumstances with which I was brought into contact are so odd that, were they set forth in a novel, I doubt whether they would gain credence. People would deny the existence of our hereditary taint. They would scout the idea of a dwarf's chamber, of a tiny size, and furnished as is Madam Tot's, with dolls' tables and chairs. No doubt they would laugh to scorn her fanciful ideas regarding fairies and gnomes, and ascribe them to insanity. As we know, this is not the case, for her fantasies are but the result of an over-vivid imagination, and her brain is as clear as crystal. Mistress Sally remains as ever my very good friend, and I rarely ride past the Lelanro Arms without pausing for a tankard of her famous ale and a few minutes' gossip. As you may remember, she was greatly amazed at my proving to be the heir to your name, and notwithstanding our care in concealing the truth, she shrewdly suspects that I am the son of the dwarf who was taken away by her brother. But in spite of her garrulity, she is as close as the grave on this one point, which affects our honour, and never by word or deed hints that she knows of the secret chamber or of the race of dwarfs. I have often talked to Madam Tot about that ingenious puzzle which she constructed out of our name. Had she only been able to do so without altering the date of birth, I might have discovered the truth sooner. As it was, the taking of 10 years from my father's life threw me all out, and indeed I have often questioned myself as to whether under the circumstances I could possibly be his son. Of course, the adding of 10 years proves that I was born when he was 21 instead of at the absurd age of 11, so I am now fully convinced to the contrary. Yet had not Madam Tot been present at that important interview to explain her alteration of the date, grave complications might have arisen concerning my identity. She is just the same good little creature, as full of fancies and fairy ideas as ever. I play my violin often to her, and then she is happy, while it is ridiculous, the care the tiny creature takes of Celia, who towers above her. She passes most of her days in the summer-house, for she is much less inclined to join in the fairy revels than aforetime. There I found her yesterday weeping bitterly, and after some persuasion she confided to me the cause of her trouble. "I had hoped," she said mysteriously, "that Oberon would have sent you and Cecilia a fairy changeling like myself, so as to make you happy, but he will not do so. Yesterday the little red gnome told me that the King of Faery had decided to leave the human child and not replace it by a fairy infant. So your child will grow into a man-mountain like yourself, and I, who hoped for a fairy playfellow, will be left desolate." Though this was but a fantasy of her brain, I was secretly glad to hear it, and I trust that her prophecy may come true. Indeed, she says that when she dies, the dwarf's chamber will be shut up, for Oberon, irritated at the way in which you sent your son out of the house, had decided to give no more changelings to the Lelanro family. Nay, more, he will signify his intention by taking back again to Fairyland the charmed cup which Sir James Lelanro stole from the little people. But Madam Tot seems to have forgotten that the cup is not now in the possession of our family. With such fancies does Madam Tot beguile her weary days, and I am afraid she will not live long. How happy would I be could I think she was likely to be the last dwarf of our family, but I am by no means hopeful. Both from a fairy and scientific point of view, we are ignorant of the matter, and it must be left in the hands of Providence. And now, my dear grandfather, I trust you will return soon, and see me about these matters. Celia and Madam Tot send their dear love, and I remain as ever, your dutiful and affectionate grandson, Algernon Lelanro. End of chapter 21. Story 2 of The Dwarf's Chamber and Other Stories by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 2, Miss Jonathan. Chapter 1. The United States has succeeded in creating a unique type of female beauty. Such causes as climatic influence, mixture of race, social developments on the dollar basis, and the equality of the sexes have resulted in the formation of that charming being, the American girl. The tree of liberty planted by George Washington in lieu of the cherry tree he cut down has borne the blossom of Miss Jonathan. She is indigenous to the soil of Manhattan, Boston, and the city of the capital, and may be called the new Eve of a special race of the distaff order. Her Adam is selected by preference from the English peerage, aut Caesar, aut nullus. The apparent fragility of Miss Jonathan conceals a constitution of iron. Her frothy conversation hides acute intellect. She can dance all night, ride, walk, swim, play, and flirt all day, without dimming the brilliancy of her colouring or dulling the edge of her wit. Enhancing her piquant beauty by perfect costumes, She invariably contrives to interest the other sex by the charm of her manner. Her sole defect is a liability to neurosis, which entails premature old age, but this very defect in many cases is the cause of her preternatural brilliancy. Take her for all in all, she is a smart angel. No other collocation of words can express Miss Jonathan. This description in the abstract is a characterization of Mattie Kierman in the concrete. She was a typical American girl, and as attractive a specimen as could be found. Her beauty was great, her charm of manner greater, her astucity of character greatest of all. A very April was she for smiles and tears and unexpected changes of temperament. Like a bee, she could sting, with glances and words. Like a bee, she could make honey, the honey of conversation and charm. These two qualities she exercised impartially, and by tossing men betwixt such extremes in shuttlecock fashion, she managed to secure a horde of distracted lovers. Can you wonder at her success? The female composite of oppositional qualities is always attractive to the male. By the rapidity with which she can pass from one phase to the other, from sweetness to acidity, from frowns to smiles, she keeps him in a constant state of alarm and fearful pleasure. He woos danger, as it were, at the cannon's mouth. A careless word ignites the powder, and his hopes, his pleasures, and his comfortable assurance are shattered on the instant. He has scarce time to contemplate one side of her character before she presents him with another. So Cleopatra had changed the fickle Antony. Novelty never stales, nor do surprises weary. At Newport, Mrs. Scheveningen took upon herself to read Mattie a lecture. This matron was 35 years of age, experienced in social observances, and in the intricacies of the masculine character. She had not experimented with Mr. Scheveningen's heart 15 years before without knowing something of the organ. Her learning instructed her how far she could advance into the enemy's camp without cutting off her retreat. In plain English, she knew how to manipulate the characters of men when rendered workable by love. This notable information she imparted to Mattie. The maid, wise in the conceit of 20 years, did not take kindly to the instruction. "It's not that I mind your flirting," said Mrs. Scheveningen frankly. "There's no harm in that, though it is playing with fire. Men can look after themselves, and their hearts are tough enough where their vanity is concerned. But if you mean business, you must be careful. Now, there's Silas Winter, who—" "I don't want to marry him," interrupted Mattie, pursing up her lips. "He's a dude. I don't like dudes. They're so dreadfully like women. Dress and scent and lisp and vanity. How can you advise me to marry such a creature? He is rich, you wretched girl, and you have no money." "I have enough to live on," replied Mattie carelessly. "You don't suppose I'd marry your winter creature for a home? You must marry for something." "Then I'll marry for love." "Sentiment!" groaned Mrs. Scheveningen, lifting her hands. "And your face is your fortune. You ought to marry a rich man." "Do you call Silas Winter a man?" said Mattie scornfully. "I don't." "My dear, he is rich, and he loves you." "There's always two to a bargain," rejoined Miss Kierman calmly. "I'm not rich, and I don't love him. When I marry," continued she, with increasing colour, "I'll marry a man." Mrs. Scheveningen arose from her chair, and, approaching Mattie, tapped the tell-tale cheek. Then she kissed her visitor warmly, and began to ask questions. The situation explained itself between them without a word. At times the peculiar feminine faculty of intuition amounts to genius. "What is his name, dear?" asked the elderly lady insinuatingly. "Who have you in your mind's eye?" For answer, Mattie led her questioner to a table, and pointed to a silver-framed portrait, full length, of a young man. "I have that person in my mind's eye," said she, with a roguish glance. "My!" ejaculated Mrs. Scheveningen, taking stock of the photograph. "It's your cousin." "It is my cousin, Leonard Conway, of the Firs, Kent, England," asserted Mattie, nodding her head. I'm in love with him. Hasn't he a noble brow? Isn't his figure like that of the dying gladiator? And his face, my dear, perfect. Do you think he and Silas belong in the same species? I don't. Or else the monkey has not yet merged in the man. Silas is only the missing link so far." After she had digested these enthusiasms, Mrs. Scheveningen returned to her seat and entered a protest against them. It took her some time to recover her breath for the purpose. "Matty Kierman, you can't be in love with a man whom you've never seen." "Why not? There's no law against it." "Why, he may be a fool." "Not with that brow." "No doubt he has a bad temper." "With that mouth? Impossible." "Very likely he isn't a marrying man." Matty looked at her piquant face in the mirror, was satisfied with the reflection, and smiled. "So long as he isn't married, that's all right," said she, touching a little curl on her forehead. She was a young lady with an excellent opinion of her charms. "You conceited little thing," laughed Mrs. Scheveningen. "Do you think you can make him fall in love with you?" "I'll try, anyhow. That is, if I like him. All your objections are fair enough. I shouldn't fall in love with a phantom, but as I'm going over to England this fall, I'll see my phantom in the flesh. If I find him desirable, I'll see if he is a St. Anthony, which he isn't with those eyes." Mrs. Scheveningen began to laugh. Something struck her as excessively ridiculous, but what it was Matty could not conceive, and she was curious accordingly. She shook her friend in pretended anger, then kissed and coaxed her, and used innumerable arts to learn the cause of such laughter. In the end Mrs. Scheveningen wiped her eyes of their merry tears and produced a letter. This she shook at Matty in playful warning. "If you will share the fate of Bluebeard's wife, you shall know all," said she solemnly. "I have Leonard Conway's private opinion of you in this letter." "How can he have an opinion of me when he doesn't know me and hasn't set eyes on me? And how can you know his private opinion when he's an absolute stranger to you?" "That is easily explained," replied Mrs. Scheveningen, opening the letter. "When I heard that you were going over to the Firs this fall, I wrote to Minnie Dawson and asked her about the Conways." "I could have saved you the trouble," retorted Matty, disdainfully. "They are our cousins 100 times removed. A Conway settled here about the time of the Revolution. My mother is his descendant, and as the English Conways condescend to acknowledge me as a relation, they have asked me to spend a few months in the old country. They know nothing about me, and I have no doubt they are in a state of mortal terror as to what kind of creature I may prove to be." Mrs. Scheveningen listened to this speech with an ostentatious air of polite interest, but paid no attention to the information conveyed therein. On the contrary, when Matty ended, she blandly took up the thread of her discourse where she had dropped it a minute or so before. Matty felt inclined to slap her friend for such indifference. "I was at school in England, you know," pursued Mrs. Scheveningen sweetly, "and Minnie Dawson, then Minnie Butler, was the only English girl I ever liked. We are bosom friends and have corresponded for years. She knows Leonard Conway intimately, so to post you up in all his idiosyncrasies, I wrote for a detailed report of his character. Here is Minnie's reply." "I'm all attention," said Matty, with a faint show of curiosity. She really desired to know something of this unknown cousin. "You ask me about Leonard Conway," read Mrs. Scheveningen, holding the letter close to her nose. "He is handsome, rich, talented, and, I am afraid, a trifle priggish." Give me the American translation of the last word. "A prig," said the reader thoughtfully, "is a person who thinks himself perfection, and who ostentatiously reveals his thoughts. A prig is an intellectual Pharisee." "I have met creatures of that type," remarked Mrs. Kierman. Bang, bang. "I have met creatures of that type," remarked Miss Kierman. "New York is full of them. What a nasty person your Minnie is, to say that my cousin is priggish. I don't believe it. Minnie also says that Mr. Conway told her that you were coming, and what he thought you would be like." Mr. Conway has doubtless created a monster after the fashion of Frankenstein." "So I think," said Mrs. Scheveningen vivaciously. "Here is your picture as a monster, my love. I—" "Give it in full," interrupted Matty calmly. "I don't mind how uncomplimentary it is. I'll punish him some day." "Mr. Conway told me that his cousin, Miss Kierman, is coming over," resumed Mrs. Scheveningen, picking up her letter, "and that he rather dreaded her coming. He is so ignorant of American girls, my dear, that he fancies the girl of fiction to be a true representation of the girl of reality. 'She will no doubt use American slang,' he said, referring to his cousin, 'and smoke cigarettes and flirt with a strong accent. No doubt she will hunt for a title and purchase a peerage with her money.' I strove to assure him, but he persisted in considering his cousin as a girl like Fuschia Leach in Ouida's novel. As a rule he is reticent, and only our long friendship would have caused him to speak freely. As Miss Kierman is a friend of yours, I am sure she is not what Mr. Conway's fancy paints her. But these are his opinions. I am afraid he is prejudiced against American girls." Matty made no comment on this letter for the moment, but walked slowly towards the window with a smile on her lips. Then she turned to Mrs. Scheveningen with a flush on her face. "I guess I'll make him sit up all around for that," she said, with a strong American accent. "Matty, don't speak in that horrid Yankee manner," said Mrs. Scheveningen in dismay. "It is the kind of way in which he expects you to talk." "That's a fact, anyway," replied Matty, still affecting the American girl of fiction. "What he expects, that he shall have. I'll be the Fuschia Leach of real life. I'll talk slang with an accent. I'll dress like an angel, and get round freely. Cigarettes I'll smoke, though I hate them. My cousin shall see me just as his fancy paints me." "In that case you'll be back here in a month," said Mrs. Scheveningen resignedly. "I never heard of such a mad idea. He'll simply detest you." "Oh, no, he won't," replied Miss Kierman determinedly. "He'll fall in love with me, notwithstanding my slang, my cigarettes, and my accent. Then I'll show myself in my true colours, and refuse to marry him." "You'll never gain him by showing the worst side of yourself, Matty." "I'll try, at all events. My turquoise brooch against your ruby ring that I succeed." "No, I shan't encourage such mad folly." "You're afraid." "I am not afraid." "Then book the bet," said Matty smartly. "I want your ruby ring." Mrs. Scheveningen laughed, and ultimately yielded. "Very well, dear, I agree. But you'll lose your brooch, or else—" "Well, or else?" "You'll win my ring, and marry your cousin." "No, I may win your ring, but I'll never marry a man who holds such opinions. Now, good-bye, dear. I'm going to buy moths and study the part of Fuschia Leach." Chapter II. That Christmas Miss Kierman was the life and soul of the house party at the Firs. None of the solemn English people there assembled had met before with the novelist's creation in the flesh, and they were startled and charmed alternately. The men were enchanted, the women horrified. She charmed the first by her beauty and vivacity, she alarmed the last by her freedom of speech and disdain of conventionality. A new dictionary was required to explain the recondite words which issued from her pretty lips. The possession of a fortune was necessary to account for the splendour of her dresses. Perhaps Mrs. Scheveningen could have explained this last, as she had financed Matty to a considerable extent. But Mrs. Scheveningen was in New York, and in default of enlightenment the house party credited Matty with a large income. Such fictitious wealth added to her charm. Leonard Conway was half pleased, half vexed with his cousin. It was gratifying to his perspicuity to see that he had not been mistaken in his estimate of her character, appearance, demeanour, and behaviour. It was irritating that one so utterly at variance with his ideal of female excellence should be so attractive. Despite his 30 years, and knowledge of the world, and high standard as to what qualities were requisite for a wife, Leonard found himself strongly drawn towards this scatterbrained creature, who satisfied him on no point, yet attracted him on all. To his mind she was the feminine counterpart of the contradictory man in Martial's epigram. He explained this after his own fashion to Mrs. Conway. "I don't like her, and yet I do like her, mother," he said one day when Matty had been particularly aggravating. "She sets my teeth on edge with her slang one minute, and charms me in spite of myself the next." "She is full of contradictory qualities," replied Mrs. Conway, who always agreed with her idol Leonard. "I never met with the species before, so I can't classify her," said Leonard in a vexed tone. "She puts me in mind of Heine's Sphinx. Her mouth caresses, her claws wound." "Oh, Leonard!" "Don't be shocked, mother. I only speak figuratively. You wouldn't like her for a daughter-in-law, I suppose?" he added, looking up suddenly. "No, I certainly would not," answered his mother decisively. "She would not make you happy." "Oh, yes, she would. For a minute, and the next put me out of temper. But you need not be afraid, mother. My head can look after my heart." "I wish you would marry Isabella Montray," said Mrs. Conway plaintively. "She's such a thoroughly good girl." "And such a thoroughly dull girl," retorted Conway. "No, thank you, mother. I don't want to go to the other extreme. If I could only find the happy medium between Matty and Miss Montray, I should discover an ideal wife. The vivacity and beauty of the one would go excellently with the pure English and good breeding of the other, but I am not likely to find such a combination," he finished with a sigh. In point of fact, he was more attracted by Matty than he chose to acknowledge, even to himself. She filled a void in his life, if not in a satisfactory manner, at least in a way which showed him that he would never be happy without her. On the other hand, he could never be happy with her. Altogether, the situation was unsatisfactory. He wished she would depart, then he hoped she would remain. He sought her society one day, and resolutely avoided her the next. It was most perplexing. "I wish she would marry Kendrick and go away," he groaned in bitterness of spirit. "Those sorts of girls always want a title. Kendrick would just suit her, and yet who could wish her tied to such an idiot?" This was unjust. Lord Kendrick was shallow, but by no means an idiot. He was not cultured, and he held his own in all outdoor sports. He could shoot, fish, ride, and row admirably. Moreover, his skill at billiards was undeniable, and he could dance exceedingly well. If not an Adonis, he was at least good-looking. If not a Chesterfield, he possessed an average amount of good breeding, and his title and fortune covered the multitude of his sins. That evening Matty spoke about him to her cousin. She could hardly fail to see that both men were in love with her. Therefore she played off one against the other in her usual fashion. The comedy amused her greatly. There was a ball taking place at the Firs. From far and near the provincials came to partake of Conway's hospitality. He was greatly liked and respected in his county, and had in him the making of a future Lord Lieutenant. Looking at the brilliant throng of his friends in the ballroom, and knowing how popular he was with them all, confident in the possession of money, health, good looks, and youth, he should have been supremely happy. Yet he was the reverse at this moment, for Matty was playing off her witcheries at his elbow. Alternately she shocked and charmed him. One moment he could have kissed her, the next he felt a mad desire to shake her thoroughly. Matty guessed the duality of his feelings, and perversely accentuated her assumed manner. She impaled her victim on a pin, and watched him writhe with complacent satisfaction. Sweet is revenge, especially to women. Who dare deny Byron's knowledge of the sex? "Lord Kendrick's spry in the leg-line, I guess," she said, watching the energetic revolutions of her title lover. "He's as lively as a woodchuck." "He certainly puts his heart into his work," replied Leonard coldly. "But to dance with one woman and to look at another at the same time is hardly likely to be successful." "That's a fact, anyhow. He's been sharp-shooting at me all night." "Do you like him?" "Some. He's real sweet, and I love him hard." "I can't say much for your taste," said Leonard, taking advantage of his cousinship to be rude. He felt that the remark was abominable, but Matty exasperated him so much that he could not help putting his thoughts into words. She guessed that his observation was wrung from him against his will, and only laughed at his petulance. Had Silas Winter spoken so, she would never have forgiven him, but it suited the requirements of her comedy to allow Leonard free speech. Therefore she joined smartly in the same strain. "I guess you don't like my taste, or anything else Amurrican." "I beg your pardon. I was rude. You know I like you, Cousin Matty." Miss Kierman measured off an inch on her fan to illustrate her next remark. "You don't cotton to me that much," said she solemnly. "I'm not your style, Cousin Leonard." "Can I get you any refreshment?" said Leonard, determined not to be drawn into an argument. I'm pretty crowded, but I can squeeze another ice." Leonard winced. Her slang grated on his ears. Matty saw his repugnance to her imagery, and smiled behind her fan. Unfortunately, it was transparent, and Leonard saw the smile. "What are you laughing at?" he asked, as they elbowed their way to the supper-room. "At your getting on stilts," she retorted coolly. "Sakes alive, you're as prim as a schoolmarm." "I evidently do not find favour in your eyes," he said in a piqued tone. "Of course, I'm not Lord Kendrick." "I guess that's so. He makes things hum when he spreads himself." "Shall I spread myself?" asked Leonard delicately. Matty paused with a spoonful of ice on its way to her mouth, and laughed gaily. "You're not that sort. My, you are stiff. Why don't you marry that Monterey girl? She's your style." "She is not my style," rejoined Leonard with some heat. "I prefer infinitely to be with you." "If that's a pop, it's no go." "What do you mean, Matty?" he asked, considerably taken aback. "I mean that I'm going to hook a lord." "You need not put it so plainly, at all events," said Leonard, with strong displeasure. "My remark was not a pop, as you call it. Let me take you back to the ballroom." This passage of arms thus terminating, Conway resolutely evaded his cousin for the rest of the night. The bittersweet pleasure to be obtained by dancing at her heels was becoming so necessary to him as to be dangerous. In vain he told himself that she was full of imperfections, that he could not possibly be happy with so capricious a wife, that she would be a plaything for him rather than a companion. All these strong arguments were nothing when opposed to the overwhelming strength of the passion growing up in his heart. He became mortally jealous of Kendrick, and was positively offensive to that well-meaning young man for daring to hint that he admired Matty. "I call Miss Kierman positively rippin'," said Kendrick, as they sat in a corner of the smoking-room. "She understands a fellow so well." "I shouldn't think you were very difficult of comprehension, Kendrick." "Oh, I don't mind your sarcasms, Conway," replied the young man good-humouredly. "I know you are cleverer than I am. I could never come within miles of you either at Eton or Christchurch, but at least I know as much about women as you do." Leonard knew that Kendrick's career had been anything but creditable since he had left college, and felt inclined to retort sharply. Happily his position as host, and a sense of good breeding, restrained him from such folly. He merely nodded his head and smoked on in grim silence, while Kendrick rambled aimlessly on. "You'll marry one of those advanced women, I dare say, Conway. I can't bear 'em. There was one after me the other day who talked astronomy. She said the stars were ruled by the law of attraction, and that human beings were like stars. I saw pretty well what she meant, and got away from her. She didn't attract me." "Does Miss Kierman attract you?" "I should just think so," replied Kendrick, with simple enthusiasm. "She can talk to a fellow about things he knows. I like the way she puts things, don't you?" "If you refer to her American expressions, I don't." "Oh, you're so particular, Conway. A man can't be always talking by the book. I like Miss Kierman's way of talking, and I like her. We jump together." "That's one of her elegancies, I presume?" "Yes. Good, isn't it? Oh, she's no end of fun. How long does she stay in England?" Till next August, I believe. She wants to have a season in town." "I'm glad of that," said Kendrick, half to himself. "There'll be a chance for me." By this remark Leonard knew that his friend contemplated matrimony. The idea displeased him greatly. He could not make up his mind to marry his cousin himself, yet he did not relish seeing her the wife of another. There was a good deal of the dog in the manger about Leonard at that time. He knew that from a worldly point of view he had no chance against Kendrick, and felt enraged that she might choose to accept the young lord. Perhaps his doubts might have been set at rest had he heard Matty talking to Mrs. Dawson in the seclusion of her bedroom. "Of course, when Julia Scheveningen told me of your absurd plot, I disapproved of it," said the latter, "and I do so more than ever. You ought to show yourself in your true colours." "No, I shan't do that," said Matty obstinately. "I came here with a certain purpose, and I intend to carry it out. Leonard must be punished for the opinion he expressed to you about me." "I wish Julia had not shown you that foolish letter, Matty. I suppose you don't intend to act this slangy part all your life?" "Certainly not. When I make Leonard propose to me, slang and all, I'll tell the truth." "He'll never propose to you in such a character." "Oh, yes, he will. He's on the high road to a proposal now." "So is Lord Kendrick," said Mrs. Dawson mischievously. "He has a title, and—" "I wouldn't marry him for 50 titles," interrupted Matty fiercely. "He's very nice and kind, but oh, so dull. Leonard is worth a dozen of him." "I believe you love your cousin." Matty made no reply, but pushed Mrs. Dawson out of the room. The remark was a true one, but she was not going to strike her colours by confessing it to be so. In her heart she was weary of the ridiculous comedy she was playing, and longed to show Leonard that she was not a slangy, fast piece of vivacity, but a clever, cultured, and well-bred girl. Yet with inconceivable obstinacy she persisted in wearing the mask. But even if she did not, and he proposed? "I believe I'll marry him after all," she said, crossly, and went to bed. Chapter 3 The next season Matty carried the Stars and Stripes triumphantly through Belgravia and Mayfair. Mrs. Conway was astonished and somewhat dismayed by the social success of the young lady whom she had undertaken to chaperon. Of a quiet and retiring disposition, she was overwhelmed by her sudden access of popularity as the guardian of Matty. Dozens of young men besieged her for introductions to the American heiress, and her visiting list doubled itself during her stay in town. Miss Jonathan, as some wit christened Matty, was decidedly the queen of the hour. Wherever she went she was surrounded by a court of admirers, who repeated her sayings and basked in the sunshine of her smiles. The triumphs of New York were repeated in London on a larger scale. Matty bore her honours with saucy dignity, and had, as she termed it in her choice vernacular, "a real good time." "I've caught on in the old country," she wrote rapturously to Mrs. Scheveningen. "It's just too lovely for anything. I believe it is within the limits of probability that I can become a peeress. Dukes are expensive articles and beyond my purse, but there is a certain Lord Kendrick who wants to marry me. He hasn't spoken yet, but you know how easy it is to tell when a man's in that state of mind. He is always by my side, and smiles and looks silly when I glance at him. The other one does nothing but scowl. You know whom I mean. He is in a great rage with me, which promises well for my little scheme. I am certain he also is on the marrying tack. I fancy that ruby ring of yours will look very well on my finger. But enough of men. Let me tell you of the fashionable frocks. They are worn—" and from discussing her position, Matty drifted into masses of millinery and elaborate explanations. From her letter it could be seen how delicate was her position. Both Kendrick and Leonard were more than ever in love with her, and showed their passions in different ways. The one smiled and followed Matty about like a poodle. The other stood aloof and looked on gloomily at the triumphs she was winning in the fashionable world. Many a time did Matty wish to tell him all, and so put an end to the embarrassing situation. but her foolish pride stood in the way of her doing so. Long ago she had confessed to Mrs. Dawson that she loved Leonard, but she declined to take that lady's advice, which was short and to the point. "Explain, and marry him," said Mrs. Dawson wisely. "How can I when he won't propose?" replied Matty tearfully. "He keeps away from me as though I had the plague." "He won't propose so long as he thinks you are what you show yourself to be. Display your true colours, my dear, and you will become Mrs. Conway in a remarkably short space of time." "No, I won't let him triumph over me in that way." "Then give up all idea of your cousin and marry Lord Kendrick," said Mrs. Dawson tartly. She was seriously angry at Matty's perversity in keeping up the deception. Leonard was a great favourite with her, and she could not bear to see him so unhappy, when a single word on the part of Matty would have put things in proper light. But that she had promised Matty to keep silent, she would have told him herself of the comedy his cousin was playing. This, however, she could not do, and she found relief in scolding Matty for her folly. Meanwhile Miss Jonathan pursued her triumphant way, attended by the smiling Kendrick and the scowling Leonard. "I shall be real mad at going back to New York City," said Matty to her cousin at the last garden party of the season, "but it's very necessary that I should recross the herring pond." "I think that matter rests entirely with yourself," replied Leonard significantly. With a sudden access of colour, Matty looked up at his face, but she saw that his eyes were fixed on Kendrick, who hovered round Mrs. Conway some distance off. The mistake annoyed her immensely. "I guess you're too deep for me," she said, in pretended grievance. "You do not usually find me so. Permit me to recall your remark that you intended to marry a title. I think you are within reasonable distance of realizing your ambition. Now if—" "I guess Lord Kendrick can do his own courtin' without you chippin' in," said Matty dryly. "I have no wish to do so, I assure you." "How you do get on stilts, cousin Leonard! How you do tease me, cousin Matty!" They looked at each other and smiled. Had they only been left alone at that moment, it is probable they would have come to an understanding. But fate, desirous of protracting the misconception, sent Kendrick to interrupt them. He had been eyeing them jealously for some time, and found comfort in the thought that they were quarrelling as usual. But when he saw Matty smiling on her cousin, he could bear it no longer, and so came forward as a spoil-sport. Matty laughed at the sulky expression of his face. "I guess you've lost $1 and picked up a cent," said she smartly. "You do look cross." "Oh, I am quite amiable, I assure you," replied Kendrick, with elaborate courtesy. "Shucks!" said Matty disdainfully. "I can see without glasses some." Leonard looked at the pair with a reflective eye. So far as he could see, Matty had quite made up her mind to be Lady Kendrick. The idea of losing her made him wrathful. Notwithstanding her accent, her slang, her freedom, her want of repose, and of many feminine traits which he valued highly, he was deeply in love with her. There was something about Matty which he could not understand. At times she forgot to play her part in the comedy, and on such occasions Leonard had been charmed and fascinated beyond all expression. A chance word, a sudden glance, a womanly action, all these betrayed a deeper nature hidden under the frivolity of her exterior. But such words were rare, and just when he began to wax sympathetic, she would flash back into the wayward society beauty, all sparkle and surface brilliance. Then he was puzzled and angered. "She's like a diamond," he thought, strolling away and leaving her with Kendrick, "as brilliant and as hard. Mr. Conway, come and sit by me. I wish to speak with you." He turned and saw Mrs. Dawson tapping a chair with the ferrule of her parasol. Knowing she was a sympathetic soul, to whom he could freely confide his troubles, he accepted her invitation readily. "I hope you are amused with this entertainment," said he in a conventional manner. "I am more amused with that entertainment," answered Mrs. Dawson, glancing towards Matty and her attendant cavalier. "Are you? I am not." "You would be more than human if you were, Mr. Conway." "What do you mean?" "Am I blind? "Am I a fool," said Mrs. Dawson impatiently, "or are you an ostrich burying your head in the sand under the delusion that no one can see you?" "I understand," replied Leonard after a pause. "But I did not know that my passion was so patent to all the world." "Am I all the world?" "You are a representative." "Why don't you marry her?" asked Mrs. Dawson abruptly. Leonard reddened, pulled his moustache, and answered, "She won't have me." "Put her to the test." "I have no chance against Kendrick," replied Conway savagely. "I haven't a title. Besides, much as I admire my cousin, she—" "Oh, I know all about that," said Mrs. Dawson, cutting him short. "She falls short of your standard of feminine excellence. I remember the picture you painted of her last year, and how you expressed your detestation of the American girl. Well, she is, as you see, faulty but charming. Yet, if you are in love with her, don't let Kendrick carry her off. Marry her yourself." "But—" "Let me tell you a parable, Mr. Conway. A certain man picked up a glittering stone. Said he, 'It glitters and glitters, but it's only a piece of glass, after all, and not worth keeping.' Then he threw it away, and it was picked up by his neighbor. The neighbor did not throw it away, but examined it carefully. Then said he, 'Lo, it is not glass, but a diamond, worth a king's ransom.'" "Well?" "Well," replied Mrs. Dawson with supreme disdain, "cannot you read my riddle? Are you going to throw away the diamond because you believe it but worthless glass? Take my advice, Mr. Conway," she added earnestly. "Be the second man of my parable." When Leonard returned home that evening, he thought long and deeply over Mrs. Dawson's allegory. It seemed to hint at some mystery connected with Matty, of which she was cognizant. He felt inclined to propose to Matty, and take the chances of her being the costly diamond or the worthless piece of glass, but he dreaded lest she should prove to be the latter rather than the former. His mother called him into her boudoir before she retired that evening. She was radiant. "Lord Kendrick asked me if he could speak to Matty to morrow afternoon," she said, smiling at her son. "Does he intend to propose?" asked Leonard, with an odd feeling in his breast. "Of course he does. It will be a brilliant match for Matty." "Will she accept him, mother?" "My dear, she would be mad to refuse," answered Mrs. Conway impressively. "Lord Kendrick is young, handsome, titled, and wealthy. What more can a girl want?" Leonard muttered something unintelligible, and left the room as quickly as possible. The news dismayed him greatly. He was on the point of then and there seeking Matty, with the intention of asking her to become his wife. Two circumstances restrained him. The one was that Matty had gone to rest, the other that it would not be fair to Kendrick. Conway thought of Mrs. Dawson's parable again, and made up his mind what course to adopt. "If she accepts Kendrick, I'll go on a shooting trip to Africa," he decided. "But if she refuses him— ah!" He drew a long breath. "If she refuses him, I'll see if Matty is the diamond or the piece of glass." Next day he saw nothing of his cousin, as he resolutely kept away from home. All the morning he remained at his club, and caught a glance of Kendrick, looking radiant with expectation of success. Not feeling inclined to speak with his rival, he left the club and went for a solitary stroll in the park. Several times he was greeted by friends of both sexes, but kept away from their neighbourhood. He worried himself with thoughts of Kendrick's success, and Matty's triumph in becoming a peeress. Not till that moment did he guess how deeply he was in love with his cousin. Notwithstanding her many deficiencies, he would gladly have made her his wife, but so far as he saw, it was too late to think of such a thing. In the afternoon he could bear the suspense no longer, and returned home to learn the worst. It was now close on 5 o'clock, and Kendrick must have learned his fate. Leonard entered the house with an assumption of calmness he was far from feeling. As he ascended the stairs, Kendrick came hastily down, and brushed past him without a word. "I say, Kendrick, I say—" Lord Kendrick muttered a hurried excuse, seized his hat, and, without waiting for the footman to open the door, did so himself. On the stairs Leonard remained transfixed with astonishment. yet with a feeling of exultation in his heart. He took in the situation at a glance. "She has refused him," he thought joyfully. "Now it is my turn." Without giving himself time for further consideration, he ran upstairs and entered the drawing-room. Mattie was looking out of the window, scarcely less white than was her dress, and looking strangely at him as he entered. With the unerring instinct of a woman, she guessed his errand from the expression of his face, and her heart gave a throb of joy as it was borne in on her that Leonard had come to ask her to be his wife. Now came the crucial test of her capability as an actress, and, strange as it may appear, she determined in one swift moment of thought to finish the comedy as she had planned. Perhaps the confident look on his face made her come to this decision. No woman likes her answer in a case of this sort to be thought certain. "He thinks I'll drop like a ripe peach," she murmured as he came towards her. "Well, we shall see." Leonard caught her hands passionately, while she nerved herself to play the part of a heartless coquette. "Mattie," cried her cousin, "you have refused him." "What do you mean?" she asked, snatching her hands away. "I guess you're too free, Cousin Leonard." "I met Kendrick. I saw his face. You—" "I have declined the honour of becoming Lady Kendrick." "Are you very sorry?" "No, I am glad. I am delighted. I wish you to marry me." Mattie looked at him with a well-simulated look of surprise. No one would have guessed the power of her self-control from that careless glance at the man kneeling at her feet. It was the moment of her revenge. "You wish to marry me?" she replied slowly. "Well, I love you, Mattie. I love you." "Sakes alive, just hear him!" laughed Mattie with mirthful eyes. Leonard sprang to his feet with a scarcely suppressed oath. The remark grated on his ears. A diamond, this slangy American flirt! Rather was she the worthless piece of glass. Still fascinated by the piquant beauty of her face, he made another attempt. "This is no jest, Mattie. Will you be my wife?" "Your wife? Well, I should smile." This finished it. Without a word, with a glance full of impotent anger, Leonard swiftly left the room. Mattie was triumphant, but looked anything but pleased at the success of her comedy. Her smiles vanished as the door closed, and she sat down on the sofa, biting her lip to keep back her tears. Still, in her foolish pride, she strove to console herself with the thought of her own firmness of character. "I said I would bring him to my feet, in spite of slang and eccentricity," she muttered defiantly, "and I have done so. He is punished for the way in which he spoke, and I'm quite satisfied. I am quite in proof of which she buried her face in the sofa cushions and burst into tears. She was hardly a minute in this humiliating position when she felt two strong arms lift her up. With a cry she turned her tear-stained face upward and saw Leonard. "Mattie, Mattie, I cannot go. I have come back. Surely you love me as I love you. These tears tell me so." All Mattie's pride was gone by this time, and she leaned her head on his shoulder. By finding her in tears he had her at a disadvantage. "Say you will marry me," urged Leonard in a low voice. "You must marry me." "I am not fit to be your wife," cried Mattie, striving to release herself. "I use American slang, I smoke cigarettes, I flirt with a strong accent, and I have hunted for a title." Leonard looked at her in amazement. She spoke good English, with hardly any transatlantic accent, and, moreover, she repeated almost word for word his opinion of American girls. "Mrs. Dawson has been telling you my foolish speech regarding you," he said gravely. "No. I saw a letter she wrote to Mrs. Scheveningen about me. Your fancy portrait was so ridiculous that I determined to punish you by realizing it." "Oh!" cried Leonard, a sudden light breaking in upon him. "Then you have been playing a part?" "Yes, to punish you," said Mattie, laughing in spite of tears and anger. "Well, I am sufficiently punished. But now that you have finished your comedy, perhaps you will condescend to accept me as your husband. True comedies always end in marriage." "But I talk slang." "You don't at present." "I smoke cigarettes." "You only did that out of bravado." "True enough," said Matty ruefully. "I can't bear smoking. But you forget I hunted for a title." "And let it go when you caught it," replied Leonard, smiling. "Come, Matty, we have been at cross purposes long enough. I was anxious to marry the false Matty. I am still more anxious to marry the real one. Will you be my wife?" Matty looked up into his face with a smile, and her answer may be guessed from the text of the cablegram she sent next day to Mrs. Scheveningen in New York. "Send me your ruby ring, and expect a piece of my wedding cake." End of Story 2. Story 3 of The Dwarf's Chamber and Other Stories by Fergus Hume. This recording is in the public domain. Story 3, The Dead Man's Diamonds. 1. All things considering, I scarcely think that my uncle acted in strict accordance with his religious principles. As a man, as an injured husband, doubtless, he had, broadly speaking, some excuse for his conduct. But seeing that he was a clergyman, and rector of Polwheal, Cornwall, he should have forgiven his enemies, and not have discounted his chances of salvation by plotting crime on, as one may say, his death-bed. But the Tregarthens were never famous for meekness of spirit, and, after all, he gave the guilty pair at least one chance of escape, which they did not take. Had they done so, this story would not have been written, nor would I have been so well-to-do as I am. They were his divorced wife Lillian, and Jack Westleigh, the man who had brought about the intervention of the law. I cannot hold Uncle Tregarthen entirely blameless in the matter, for he should have known better than to have married, at 60 years of age, a girl whom he knew to be in love with her cousin. If Westleigh had not been poor, Squire Lawton would not have objected to the match, but a briefless barrister and a pauper spinster, the idea was madness. Lawton only acted within his fatherly rights, and wisely, when he forbade the cousins to see or even to think of each other. These prohibitions, however, were of no avail, for Westleigh, in defiance of paternal wrath, took up his quarters in the village, and gained occasional glimpses of Lillian. They corresponded also by letter, making use of an aged oak on the borders of Lawton Park as an intermedium of communication. Into a hole in the trunk, a disused tit's nest, Westleigh would slip a note, and next day return for the answer, which invariably awaited him in this strange post-office. Occasional glimpses, still more occasional conversations, and continual letters went on for 6 months between this Juliet and her Romeo, until the squire, discovering love's roguery, ended the romance by marrying Lillian to Mark Tregarthen, rector and eccentric. The harsh-featured and whimsical old man was not attractive to the 19-year-old girl, and Lillian, although she did not dare to disobey her father, bitterly resented the match. Her married life was unhappy and short, for, unable to agree with her aged husband, impatient of his eccentric habits and domineering ways, she fled to London, and there sought the protection of her lover. Uncle Tregarthen obtained a divorce, after which he refused to mention the name of his disgraced wife, but, retiring into his misanthropic self, he became daily more odd in his conduct. These things happened 10 years before I became personally acquainted with Uncle Tregarthen, so I repeat them from hearsay. In the sequel I took an active part, as will be seen hereafter. Uncle Tregarthen was my mother's brother, but she had long since ceased to see or even to correspond with him. This was less her fault than his, for he designedly cut himself off from the family, leading a misanthropic and solitary life among his wild parishioners. These were mostly fishermen and miners, to the saving of whose souls Uncle Tregarthen paid less attention than to his hobby for collecting diamonds. He lived in a dilapidated rectory. He scrimped and screwed his housekeeper and himself in the matter of food and creature comforts. In all ways he behaved in a most miserly fashion, and devoted the money thus saved to the purchase of gems. His private income, his stipend, his savings in the matter of household and other expenses, were used solely for this purpose, and Polwheal Rectory was looked on as the Golconda of Cornwall. Why my uncle should have developed so expensive and useless a hobby I could never understand. No one, save himself, saw his diamonds, which were locked up in an iron safe let into the wall of his study. He did not even adorn his wife with them during the short period of her married life. So long as they were in his safe he was satisfied, and for 40 years he added to his collection until the value of the gems amounted to a fabulous sum. I am afraid to say how much. The rough fishers and still rougher miners knew of his wealth, but none attempted to steal the jewels. They were too attached to their eccentric parson to think of doing so. Therefore Mark Tregarthen's riches were as safe in that house on the lonely Cornish coast as they would have been in the Bank of England. I regret to say that my father, a thriftless man of letters, was indifferently well off, and when he died left my mother almost penniless to bring me up as best she could. In this strait she applied to her husband's well-to-do relatives for assistance, and received moneys from all save Uncle Tregarthen. He did not even trouble to acknowledge the letter, much to the anger of my mother. All the same, he may remember us yet, she said, after many fruitless applications, extending over several years. I am his only sister, and you, Francis, his only nephew. He must leave his money to one or the other of us. Unless he marries himself, I suggested. Mark will never marry, replied my mother convincedly. He is a confirmed bachelor. Subsequent events proved her to be wrong, for shortly we received the news of the marriage to Lillian Lawton, which dashed our hopes to the ground. A year afterwards came the intelligence of his divorce, which raised them again. 5 years later a letter from the eccentric himself came to hand. "I have been informed," began the letter abruptly, "that your son Francis is now 20 years of age. If he is not a fool, which he must be if he takes after his father, I should like to see him. Send him to me at once. It will be the better for him and for you. Your brother, Mark." In response to this amiable invitation, I obtained a month's holiday from the office wherein I was then employed, and repaired to Polwheal, where I presented myself before my eccentric relative. I found him a powerful-framed, grizzled man, moody and suspicious. He beheld in me an etiolated youth with pale cheeks and round shoulders, both induced by desk-work. Neither of us approved of the other's looks. "You miserable whelp," said grim Uncle Tregarthen, "you need Cornish air and outdoor life to change you from tadpole to man. Write and resign your appointment to your London den." "But my mother, sir, she depends upon—" "I'll see to your mother," he retorted shortly. "You stay here." I hesitated to accept this offer without confirmation, whereat in a breath the dour creature blamed me for my distrust and praised me for my caution. Afterwards he instructed his lawyers to pay my mother £50 quarterly, conditionally that she never sought Polwheal Rectory, wherein I was henceforth to take up my abode. With an eye to future favours, we accepted these somewhat harsh terms, and for 3 years I dwelt with Uncle Tregarthen, a kind of prisoner on parole. The old man was not unkind to me, but neglectful and uncompanionable. He gave me no pocket money, he rarely permitted me to travel beyond the confines of the parish, and scrimped me, along with his other dependents, in the matter of food and light. Shooting was my great resource, and many a day did I spend on the moors, solitary but happy. My skill with a gun kept the larder supplied at the mere cost of powder and shot. Therefore the rector rather approved of than grudged my sport. The outdoor life developed my frame, the scanty fare kept me in excellent health, and in a few years I became an uncommonly powerful man. As will afterwards be seen, I owed my life to this rigorous training. What puzzled me during my sojourn in Polwheal were the singular habits of my uncle. Sometimes he went to London for the purpose of buying diamonds, at others he attended to his parishioners; but for the most part he would disappear for hours, and return covered with grime and exhausted with toil. Where he went, what he did, I could never discover, nor did I seek to force his secret, until one day, as I returned across the moors, I fell in with him unexpectedly. The place was on the verge of the seashore, and everywhere the ground gaped with the shafts of disused mines. Out of one of these Uncle Tregarthen suddenly appeared, and I had just time to slip behind a giant stone before he passed by me, groaning heavily. In the fast falling light it was difficult to see plainly, but I noted his pale face, his dragging gait, and I heard the laboured breath which told of severe toil. My curiosity to know the meaning of these things got the better of my prudence, and when the old man vanished, I slipped into the mouth of the mine whence he had emerged. Within all was thick gloom, but I was provided against that emergency. For the purpose of exploring tin mines I always carried matches and candles. So before diving into the shaft I lighted up and stuck my taper, miner fashion, in my cap with a lump of clay. Forward I went, doubled up, for the roof was low, and advanced cautiously, lest I should fall into some snare. It was just as well I did so, for the gallery ended in a yawning chasm which led to the lower workings of the mine. Down this hung a stout rope attached to a massive rock at the lips of the well, and I would have swung myself down, but that my candle fell from my cap. I had no other light, so for the moment I was reluctantly compelled to abandon the exploration. On my return home bad news awaited me. Uncle Tregarthen had arrived an hour previously, had called for brandy, and while lifting the glass to his lips he had fallen dead. As I afterwards learned from the doctor, the old man died of aneurism of the heart, induced by the overtaxing of his strength. I had no doubt but what the rector had worked hard at some manual labour while in the depths of that mine, but his reasons for doing so I could not understand. Sooner than I expected these came to light, and singular enough they were. At once I communicated with my mother, who came to Polwheal in time to see the last of her brother before he was buried. After the funeral the will was read, and then we received an unpleasant surprise. I had always looked on myself as the heir to the rector's jewels, but to my dismay the diamonds were left to the divorced wife Lillian and her lover. Failing their acceptance of the same, the gems were to become my property. As if they would refuse, lamented my mother. There must be £50,000 worth, Francis, and to leave them to that wicked woman. Can't we upset the will? I'm sure your uncle was mad. I don't think so, mother. He was eccentric, but not mad. The will is likely to stand the test of the law, so the only thing for us to do is to communicate with Mr. and Mrs. Westleigh. I have already done so, said the lawyer. They will be here this week. Why were they not present at the reading of the will? I asked sharply. Because they were abroad, and could not come earlier. I am sorry for you, Mr. Carson, but you are young, and will soon make your way in the world. Cold comfort that, I rejoined bitterly. Uncle Tregarthen took me out of a situation, and now turns me loose to live as best I can after 5 years of idleness. I do not think I have been treated fairly. It is scandalous, cried my mother. Quite so, said the lawyer, but the will is all right. I don't deny the leaving of the property to the divorced wife is hard, but Mr. Tregarthen was always eccentric. By the way, where are the jewels? I asked, out of mere curiosity. In the safe, I suppose, said the solicitor, selecting a key. I looked in there the other day and could not find them, but as a matter of fact my examination was cursory, very cursory indeed. We will search for them now. Surprise number 1 was the provisions of the will. Surprise number 2, the searching of the safe. It was empty. No diamonds were therein concealed, and the three of us stood looking at one another in dismay. Then Mr. Price, the lawyer, suggested that the jewels might be concealed in some other part of the house, so we made a close search. It was useless, for not a single gem could we discover. The rector had hidden his diamonds to some purpose, for no one knew their whereabouts save himself, and he was dead. "Dear, dear," murmured Mr. Price, "this is most extraordinary. You have no idea where they can be, Mr. Carson?" "Not the slightest. The only key to that safe was on the rector's watch-chain all the time I have been here. I have never seen the diamonds. Uncle Tregarthen did not honour me with his confidence so far." I thought Price eyed me somewhat suspiciously, as though he thought I had stolen the jewels. My mother saw his looks, and gave him a piece of her mind, which made him beat a hasty retreat. When he was gone, she turned to me. "Francis, you have never seen the diamonds?" "No, mother." "You have no idea where they can be?" "No, mother." We said no more, for the situation and the suspicions of Price disturbed us greatly. Mr. and Mrs. Westleigh, the legatees under the will, were to arrive on the morrow. But where was the legacy? 2. But for the loss of the diamonds, my mother and I would have left the rectory before the arrival of the Westleighs. I had no particular wish to meet my divorced aunt, and my mother was of that aggressively virtuous matron type which dreads contact with the fallen. Nevertheless, we remained, as departure might complicate matters, and I had my character to defend. Not only Price had conceived a suspicion, but Mrs. Lowdy, the half-starved housekeeper, imbibed his ideas and looked askance at me. I never felt so uncomfortable as at that time. It was bad enough to be thrown penniless on the world, through the whims of an old man, but it was worse to be suspected of thieving the property, which morally, if not legally, I looked on as mine. There was something ironical about such circumstances. Nor was my discomfort lessened by the arrival of the Westleighs. He was a fresh-coloured, insolent creature, loud-voiced and coarse-minded. She was a pretty woman who adored this male brute, and was a slave in consequence. That he loved her in an animal sort of way I do not deny, but his selfish egotism would not permit her to be happy. To my mind, the second marriage of Lillian Lawton was even more unfortunate than the first. My mother was kind, but cold, to the wife. A compliment returned by Westleigh, who was insolent and overbearing to me. For obvious reasons I kept my temper, although he tried it sorely, by pointed allusions to the loss of the diamonds. With characteristic meddlesomeness, Price had driven to the nearest railway station, and had informed Westleigh of the loss, and of his doubts, so that when the man arrived he was quite prepared to accuse me of the theft without a shadow of foundation. "A strange business this, Mr. Carson," he said when we were alone after dinner. "You mean about the diamonds?" "Yes. Where are they?" "I am afraid I cannot tell you, Mr. Westleigh. All the time I have lived with my uncle I have never even seen the jewels. I understood that he kept them in his study safe, but they are not there now." "Do you know their value?" "I have not the least idea." Westleigh looked at me with a sneer. "Yet you no doubt expected to be your uncle's heir." "Certainly. The jewels ought to have been left to me. Your wife excuse me, Mr. Westleigh, for speaking so plainly but your wife forfeited her claim to my uncle's property by her behaviour." No doubt you wish to make her suffer for that slip." "What do you mean, sir?" I asked the question indignantly, for the man's insolence stung me cruelly. He, like myself, was on his feet, and leaning one hand on the table, he bent towards me with a frown. "I mean, Mr. Carson, that you know more about these jewels than you choose to tell. Naturally you are aggrieved at being left out of the will, and I dare swear you have taken steps to remove those diamonds to a safe hiding-place." It was fortunate that Mrs. Lowdy entered the room at that moment and compelled me to restrain myself, else I would have sprang at the insolent brute who so coldly accused me of theft. As it was, I stood silently controlling my passion while Wesley received a letter from the housekeeper. "My late master asked me to give you this on your arrival, Mr. Wesley," said Mrs. Lowdy with a curtsy, "and having placed it in your hands, sir, I have discharged my duty." She then left the room, and after a doubtful glance at me, Wesley tore open the envelope. Wondering what Uncle Tregarthen could have to say to the man who had wrecked his domestic happiness, I waited. Wesley read the note it was not very long and then turned towards me with a studied courtesy which was even more objectionable than his insolence. "I ask your pardon for my late speech, Mr. Carson," he said, in a voice charged with excitement, "for I have suspected you wrongly. I now know where the Tregarthen diamonds are hidden." "Indeed! Does that letter—" Before I could finish my remark, he placed the note in my hands, and in the crabbed Greek handwriting of my late uncle I read as follows: "The diamonds are hidden for safety in the Trevethy Mine. Enter the shaft with the red star, follow the rope, and it will guide you to the hiding place. Take spade and pickaxe, for the place is hermetically sealed. One thing only I ask of you. When you seek the jewels, take with you my late wife Lillian. Both of you have wronged me deeply, and you owe it to me to obey my last request. Seek the jewels together, or leave them to my nephew, Francis Carson." There was no signature to this extraordinary letter, and I returned it to Wesley with a sudden enlightenment of the mind. This was then the reason of Uncle Tregarthen's long absences, of his toil and grimy appearance, the reason of his emergence from the shaft of the Trevethy Mine. The diamonds were concealed therein. I wondered that I had not guessed as much when they were missing from the house. "I expect he was afraid of being robbed," said Wesley, with a peculiar glance at me, "and so concealed the jewels in that mine. Well, we will seek them to morrow. Will you come also, Mr. Carson?" "Certainly, if you wish it," said I quietly, "but the letter stipulates that your wife should go with you." "I'll see her about it at once," he replied resolutely. "No doubt she will make some objection, but I am not going to lose a fortune simply because she is afraid of descending a tin mine." As Wesley anticipated, his wife was by no means willing to descend into the depths of the Trevethy Mine. She appeared apprehensive lest the letter of the dead man should conceal some sinister design, and indeed I had my doubts on the matter also. A dour creature like Uncle Tregarthen was not likely to forgive an injury, and his ostentatious pardon of the pair who had wronged him so deeply seemed ironical. Mrs. Wesley thought so too. "I am afraid, Jack, I am terribly afraid," she cried, clinging to his arm, when he broached the subject. "Evil will come of this. Let us give up the diamonds to the nephew and go away." "You must take me for a fool, Lillian," replied her husband crossly. "Give up 50,000 or 60,000 pounds! I'll do no such thing. We will go down this mine to morrow." "No, no, I shall not." "You shall. You must. Don't be foolish. There can be no possible danger." Mrs. Wesley thought differently and continued to object, but during the night the stronger will dominated the weaker, and next morning she professed her willingness to carry out the dead man's instructions. In the meantime Wesley had sent for Pryce, and when he arrived showed him the letter. "Most extraordinary," said the lawyer, when he had mastered its contents. "I was always under the impression that my late client kept the jewels in his safe. That was evidently a blind, and he constructed a secret place in the Trevethy Mine. Mr. Carson," he added, turning to me, "I beg to apologize for my unjust suspicions. I see now that you are innocent." "I owe you no thanks for that, Mr. Pryce," said I bitterly. "The evidence of this letter is too strong for you to disbelieve, but you might have given me the benefit of the doubt." These three people were all hostile to me, but for my curiosity concerning the hiding place of the diamonds, I should have left Polwheal Rectory that day with my mother. As it was, I persuaded her, sorely against her will, to stay, and at 12 o'clock we set out for the Trevethy Mine to seek the jewels. As I passed out of the door, Mrs. Lowdy plucked me by the sleeve. "I ask your pardon, sir," she whispered. "I suspected you wrongly. But you will be rewarded for your trouble, Mr. Carson." "What do you mean, Mrs. Lowdy?" She screwed up her mouth and nodded significantly. "When they find the diamonds, you come back to me, and I'll give you a message from the master." Before I could ask for an explanation, she vanished into the house and shut the door, while I ran on to join the party, now some distance ahead. I began to be suspicious of the motives of my dead uncle. He had left a letter for Wesley and a message for me, and I suspected that blindly we were carrying out some design dangerous to some, if not to all, of us. So strongly was this borne on us that I determined to dissuade Wesley from descending the shaft. There was no difficulty in finding the main entrance to the Trevethy mine. It was the same whence I had seen the old man emerge on the day of his death. And to distinguish it from the other gaping mouths, a splotch of red paint was rubbed on the grey stone face. Under the bright blue sky, on the verge of the rugged shore, we stood, a party of 5, looking at the yawning mine down which we had to descend to recover the jewels. Wesley, as instructed by the letter, had brought a pickaxe and shovel with him, and with these over his shoulder he prepared to step into the mouth. Lillian, with a sudden access of terror, drew back, and flung herself into the arms of my mother. "I can't, Jack, I daren't," she wailed fearfully. "There is danger. I am sure there is danger." "Rot!" cried Wesley, seizing her roughly by the hand. "You must come. I don't wish to lose the jewels for your scruples. Come on." "I think Mrs. Wesley is right," I interposed. "I feel sure that Uncle Tregarthen has some sinister design in this." "Bah!" sneered Wesley. "You want the jewels for yourself." Pryce took a pinch of snuff and looked doubtfully at me. "It might be as you say, Mr. Carson," he remarked. "I never yet knew your uncle to forgive his enemies." "Don't go," said my mother, drawing back Lillian. "Let the diamonds be." "You want them for your son," scoffed Wesley. "But they are mine by right, and I mean to have them. Come, Lillian." She shuddered, and gave one despairing glance around at the sky, sun, and sea, then, dominated by her husband's will, she followed him into the tunnel, leaving the 3 of us looking at one another. "You are afraid to go, I see," said Pryce, with a jeering look at me. "No," I answered, "I intend to see this out. I suspect something is wrong, but if Wesley does not keep his eyes open, I shall." Silencing my mother's objections with a kiss, I slipped into the gallery after Jack Wesley and his wife, and in a few minutes I found myself standing with them on the lips of the hole which led into the bowels of the mine. The 3 of us were now fully committed to the adventure. Would that we had foreseen the end, and had retired while there was yet time. 3. The situation was enough to try the nerves of a stronger woman than Mrs. Wesley, and she leaned against the sides of the tunnel, faint with terror. Seeing this, her husband administered a sup of brandy from his travelling flask, and so braced her up for the adventure. She became as anxious as he to find the jewels, and professed her willingness to descend into the shaft, whence she had shrunk some minutes before. Taking advantage of this sudden access of courage, Wesley made ready for the descent. "It will be awkward for you to scramble down by this rope," he said, kneeling on the edge of the shaft. "Hullo! Here's a rope ladder. That's capital. Lillian, I shall go down first. You follow me, and then if Mr. Carson chooses to come he can do so." "Mr. Carson does choose to come," I said sharply. "But how are you going to lower this pickaxe and spade?" "By this rope, of course," replied Wesley, drawing up the cord which swung by the rope ladder. "See, I'll tie them to the end and lower them so. The shaft is not so deep as I thought." We heard the clink of the iron as axe and spade clashed at the bottom of the shaft. Afterwards, with a reassuring word to his wife, Wesley cautiously descended the rope ladder, and, bending over the yawning mouth, I could see the candle fastened in his cap, twinkling star-like in the thick gloom. After the elapse of some minutes he apparently reached the ground, for we heard him shout faintly, and felt the guiding rope violently shaken. "Now, Mrs. Westleigh, it is your turn," said I, and as she started nervously back, I added encouragingly, "Do not be afraid. I will tie the end of this rope to your waist, and you will thus be supported while descending the ladder." With an effort she consented, and pulling the rope up, I bound the end round her waist. Then she swung herself fearfully onto the shaking ladder, and I let the cord play out slowly through my hands as she clambered down. In a few minutes she accomplished the descent also, and like glow worms the candle lights glimmered at the bottom of the shaft. Without hesitation I gripped the rope, and, making no use of the ladder, I precipitated myself into the abyss. Accustomed as I was to cliff climbing, it was easy work for me to descend, and shortly I found myself standing beside the pale wife and the anxious husband in the bowels of the earth. By this time the effect of the spirit had died out in Mrs. Westleigh, and in the wavering light of the candles her face showed curiously pale. Notwithstanding her awe of Westleigh, I believe she would have fled, but that it was now too late to retreat. Her husband, with flushed face and bright eyes, paid little attention to her agitation, but he groped about for the rope which, as mentioned in Uncle Tregarthen's letter, would guide him to the place where the jewels were hidden. "Here it is!" he cried in an exulting tone, picking it up from the side of the gallery. "Carson, look after my wife, and follow me." Little as I liked her, I was sorry for the poor woman. She gripped my hand with the courage of despair, and we hurried along the gallery after Jack Westleigh. The tunnel proceeded in a horizontal direction for some distance, until it stopped short at another chasm, down which depended a rope ladder. Our descent was accomplished in the same manner as before, and again we walked on. I judged that by this time we were under the sea, so that the adventure was even more perilous than we had deemed it. "Hark!" I said, pausing a moment with Lillian's hand in mine. "We are under the sea. Do you hear the reverberation of the waves?" We all listened intently, and heard distinctly the rumble of the waters overhead, the grating of the rocks grinding along the bed of the sea, and the drowsy swell of the waves seething on the rugged beach. By the lights of the candles we could see that the rocks within which we were entombed were quite dry, and here and there a glint of light was struck from the veins of ore threading the sides of the tunnel. The air was thick and muggy, so that we could hardly breathe. "Oh, Jack, I am afraid, I am afraid!" moaned Lillian in wide-eyed terror. "Let us go back." "What? After coming so far? Not if I know it," was his response, and he seized his wife as she sank on the rocky floor. "Get up and come along, you fool!" Passive in his hands from sheer terror, she permitted herself to be led forward, and after 5 minutes we emerged on a kind of platform, beyond which opened a huge vaulted chamber. The rope descended here, and Westleigh looked over to find the expected ladder. There was none. "I must scramble down as best I can," he grumbled, slinging axe and spade over his shoulder. "You can wait here, Lillian, with Carson." "Shall I help you?" I asked as he gripped the rope. "No, thank you," was his sneering retort. "I would rather find the jewels alone. I don't trust you, my friend." Indignation held me silent, and I busied myself attending to Mrs. Westleigh, while her husband dropped into the darkness. The precipice proved of no great height, for we saw his light suddenly steady as he touched ground 10 feet below. "The rope runs to the right," he called up, and then we saw the glimmer of his candle moving athwart the gloom. A shout of joy announced that he had reached the end of his journey, and had found the treasury place. "The old man has bricked up the hole," he shouted. "It's about 4 feet square, but I'll soon have this wall down. It runs all along the side of the vault." A moment afterwards the blows of the pickaxe echoed in the vault, and Lillian on her hands and knees peered into the gloom, watching the dancing light as her husband moved his head with every stroke. For a few minutes he plied the pickaxe, then rose a cry of fear, The light went out, and we heard the roar of many waters. Lillian shrieked aloud. "Help! Help! Carson! Lillian!" cried Wesley in muffled tones. "I have let in the sea! I have—" The waters broke down the brickwork which ran along the side of the vault, and surged tempestuously into the hollow. They gripped Wesley in their strength and dashed him against the rocky sides. He gave one shriek, echoed by Lillian, and then all was still, save the roaring of the rapidly rising waters. "Mrs. Wesley, let me save you!" I cried, seizing her in my arms. "No, no! My husband! Ah!" she screamed, as a dark body borne on the turbid waters swept under the feeble glimmer of our candles. "Jack! Jack!" Before I could tighten my grip on her, before I could guess her purpose, she tore herself from my arms and hurled herself into the black pool, now streaked and marbled with white foam. I heard her cry as she was swept into the darkness, and I staggered back under the force of the incoming flood, which now was up to my knees. I could save neither him nor her. I was in danger of losing my own life, and in an agony of fear I turned and raced for safety along the lower gallery. Even in that terrible moment I recognized the fearful vengeance which had been meted out by Mark Tregarthen to the guilty pair. Quick as I was in gaining the first shaft which led to the higher levels, the waters were quicker still, and as I rapidly clambered up the rope ladder, the salt flood growled and bubbled at my heels. It forced its way up the narrow shaft at tremendous speed, and the floor of the second gallery was already ankle deep before I had covered half the distance. At the last shaft the turbulence of the flood somewhat abated, therefore I judged that I was on a level with the ocean, but as I scrambled up the second ladder the waters still continued to swell, though slowly. Half-way up they stopped and rolled hoarsely from side to side. With a prayer of thanksgiving for my escape, I flung myself exhausted on the floor of the tunnel which led to the open air. Of the three of us, I alone had saved my life. The reason for my uncle's strange will and stranger letter can now easily be guessed. He had forgiven neither his wife nor Wesley, but by appealing to their greed he had brought about the death of both. For years he must have toiled constructing that brickwork which alone kept out the waters of the sea. How he managed to accomplish so great a task unaided, I cannot say. By what means he pierced the ocean floor so that the waters would pour into the mine the moment the brickwork was destroyed, it is impossible to guess. But the fact remained that with inconceivable malignancy he had made Wesley the instrument of his own fate. By tempting him with the promise of the diamonds, he had induced the wretched man to destroy by his own free will the only barrier between him and death. I saw now why he wished Wesley and Lillian to go together to the mine. It was to doom them to the cruel death which I had escaped so narrowly. The Trevethy mine was filled almost to the mouth with water, and in its grim depths were concealed the corpses of those who had wronged the rector of Polwheal. I challenge fiction to produce a more gruesome tragedy than that which I have narrated. On recovering somewhat from my exhaustion, I staggered along the tunnel and emerged, battered, bruised, and grimy, into the glare of the sunshine. As in a dream I saw my mother and Pryce rise in alarm from the stones whereon they were seated. As in a dream I heard them ask for the Wesleys, and I heard my own voice tell of the terrible catastrophe. Then I faintly saw their faces of horror at the recital, and fell down in a swoon, almost as void of life as those unhappy beings entombed in the watery depths below. And now comes in the strangest part of this strange story. When I came to my senses I was lying on my bed with my mother anxiously bending over me. With maternal care she held some wine to my lips, and so efficacious was the draught that soon I was able to sit up and converse. "You have been unconscious for over 2 hours," said my mother in response to my inquiries. "We carried you here, and then Pryce with some men went back to see if the Wesleys could be rescued." "Impossible, mother. They were both drowned before I escaped from the mine. I should have been drowned also, but that I made use of my speed and my strength. What a terrible vengeance Uncle Tregarthen prepared for those unhappy people." "Terrible indeed, Francis. But I always knew that my brother was vindictive, although I did not think he would have sinned so wickedly on his dying bed. Lillian is gone, Wesley is gone, and the diamonds—" "They are gone also." "I am not so sure of that," said my mother significantly, producing a letter from her pocket. "Mrs. Lowdy, who has followed Mr. Pryce to the mine, gave me this for you. It is from your uncle." I opened the letter and read it aloud without further delay. The contents astonished us both. "Nephew Francis," began the letter in my uncle's well-known handwriting, "when you receive this letter, I hope my guilty wife and her lover will be dead. I have given them one chance of escape, by appealing to their moral feelings as to whether they deserve my money or not. If they can conquer their greed and refrain from descending into the Trevethy Mine, doubtless they are alive still. If, on the other hand, they have been shameless enough to claim the property of one whom they have wronged cruelly—well, you know what has occurred. For years I have brooded over my vengeance. For years I have toiled to build a slight wall against the sea which threatened to flood the mine. How I discovered the danger, how I accomplished the work, there is no need to say. Sufficient is it for me to declare that my hate gave me strength and ingenuity to prepare this trap. If they have fallen into it, I am glad. If they are alive still, God will punish them in his own good time. In any case, the diamonds are yours. I did not hide them in the Trevethy Mine. That was but a lure to accomplish my vengeance. No, the jewels, to the amount of £80,000, are hidden in the trunk of the oak tree on the borders of the Lawton estate, where my wife was accustomed to meet her lover. Put your hand into the tit's nest they used as a post-office. There you will find a cord, at the end of which is a leathern bag containing the jewels. If I have accomplished my revenge, I feel no sorrow. If they are dead, I am glad. I shall welcome them to the next world with joy. They sought wealth, they found death. Bless you, my boy, and curse them. Mark Tregarthen. There is no more to be said. As directed by the letter, I sought the oak, I found the jewels, and these ultimately realized the sum of close on £80,000. The bodies of Lillian and Jack Wesley were never recovered, as it was found impossible to drain the mine. Thanks to my uncle's bequest, both my mother and myself live in affluence and ease, but neither of us have ever revisited Polwheal, which to us is fraught with horror. The horrible story of my uncle's vengeance is still related at winter firesides, and no legend is so popular or so firmly believed as that of the dead man's diamonds. End of Story 3. Story 4 of The Dwarf's Chamber and Other Stories by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 4. The Tale of the Turquoise Skull. Part 1. This story has been told by 3 different men. Each has embellished it according to his fancy and constituted himself the hero. I object to these egotistical pilferers, for I am alone entitled to tell in the first person the tale of the turquoise skull. Should any one question my right to this principal role, I can point out that the forefinger of my left hand is missing. That loss substantiates my statement. I should like to know if these other 3 storytellers lack the forefingers of their left hands. If not, they stand convicted of plagiarism. When Harry Carstone and I went to the USA on a shooting excursion, we intended to strike for the Rockies. It was by no deliberate design that we found ourselves at Zacatecas. By a series of accidents which need not be set forth here, we drifted aimlessly southward. From New York we traveled to New Orleans, thence took ship to Vera Cruz, and as a natural consequence we terminated our journey in Mexico City. And here we should have remained, had not Fate, by her favorite device of feminine influence, lured us, or rather one of us, to Zacatecas. If Harry had not followed Lola Tepeaca from capital to province, he might now be alive. As it was, he left Mexico City for Zacatecas, where he found Lola, the turquoise skull, and a grave. I came out of the affair with my life and the loss of a finger. To save Harry I would have willingly given the whole hand, but it was not to be, and although I punished Lola for her evil deeds, such reprisal was but poor compensation for the death of my college chum. Ostensibly we sought Zacatecas in the mining interest, but I gave up my time to sightseeing, and Harry spent most of his with Lola. Only once did I accompany him to her dwelling. Then, seeing that I was an inconvenient third, I went no more. As for Lola, she usually smoked cigarettes in a grass hammock swung on the azotea, while Harry sat at her feet and talked. I guessed what formed the gist of these conversations, from my friend's flushed face and sparkling eyes at their conclusion, and judging that such trifling was unwholesome, I ventured a remonstrance, which he promptly resented. Experience should have taught me the futility of interfering. "You can't marry the girl," said I impatiently. "She is half Indian and wholly diabolical." Harry drew his brows together, as was his habit when annoyed. I remembered that sign of temper at Eton when he went up for punishment. Still he answered temperately enough. "I know she is a half-caste, but she is not the other thing." "Isn't she, though? If ever I saw evil in a woman's eyes—" "You need say no more, Frank," he interrupted hotly. "It is shabby to speak ill of a woman behind her back." "I will say it to her face if you like, Harry. Believe me, she is no good, and she will certainly get you into trouble." "I can take care of myself. I am no fool." "You are a man, at all events," I retorted, "and all men are fools where a woman is concerned. Do you intend to present Lady Carstone with a half-caste daughter-in-law?" "That is neither here nor there," said he sulkily, and turned on his heel to intimate that my interference was uncalled for. Later on he left the hotel to call on his Venus Pandemus. Having been thus rewarded for my mediation, I walked to the Casa de la Estrella to visit Fray Benito. He was a Dominican monk of archaeological tastes, with whom I had foregathered shortly after my arrival at Zacatecas. His monastery, named after the Star of Bethlehem, was a peaceful old dwelling, with courts and corridors, a wonderful chapel, and an extensive library. When Fray Benito was not praying in the chapel, he was reading in the library, and here I found him wrestling with the crabbed Latin of a priestly author. Our friendship was based on a common love for archaeology, but as Harry's taste did not lie in that direction, he sought neither monastery nor monk, and although I had observed casually that I had a companion, I had not thought it necessary to inform the holy monk of the existence of Lola. It was only after my fruitless appeal to Harry that I mentioned the name of the half-caste siren to the Dominican. As a popular confessor in Zacatecas, he was likely to know something of the lady, and a little timely knowledge of her peculiarities might enable me to rescue Harry from her toils. This, then, was the main reason for my visit, and after a few words of courtesy I introduced the subject. The pious horror with which Fray Benito received the name of Lola served only to confirm my fears. "What is this you tell me, Don Francisco?" said he severely. "Have you been led astray by this daughter of evil?" "No, reverend sir. I speak in the interest of my friend, who is now in her toils." "God help him!" said the monk, crossing himself. "She will lure him to death, as she has lured others. Demon succuba! Would that the Holy Office were still in existence to burn thee to ashes." "Who is she, Fray?" "A demon, Signor. Have you not heard of the turquoise skull?" "No. What is the turquoise skull?" "It is an instrument of evil possessed by this creature," said Fray Benito with much energy, "the skull of a heathen king adorned with jewels and inhabited by evil spirits. With it she works her devilries. 12 men has she slain. Holy Mary, forbid that your friend should be the 13th. "You don't mean to say that she has murdered 12 men?" I demanded uneasily. The attitude of the monk frightened me. "Who knows how they die? She lures them with her beauty and gives them the turquoise skull as a token. Then they perish." "How do they perish?" "Nay, Signor, I cannot tell you. There is an unworthy brother of our order who was charmed by this succuba and fell away from his vows. In due time, as is her custom, she gave him the turquoise skull. He bore it to his cell, and he was found next morning seated before it, dead." "And the skull?" "We sprinkled it with holy water and conjured the evil spirit who dwelt therein to depart. But she came, the accursed one, and bore it away. Ay, my son, bolts and bars and stone walls could not keep her out of the house of the star. She appeared like a demon in our midst, and disappeared with the skull. We buried Fray Anselm at midnight. May his soul find peace." At the conclusion of this story, the friar betook himself to his prayers and his rosary, and seeing that my presence was distasteful, I left him to his devotions. This was the first time I had heard of the turquoise skull, but was to hear of it again within an hour. This time it was from a leprero. There was no connection between monk and vagabond, yet both spoke of the same thing. Fate is fond of duplicating incidents. My acquaintance with Don Francisco Diaz de Grijalva, so he styled himself, began by my saving his life. The leprero was crossing the road when a stallion beyond the control of its rider dashed round the corner. Had I not instinctively rushed forward and dragged Don Panchito out of harm's way, assuredly he would have been trampled to death. This he recognized, for, having devoutly crossed himself, he shook his fist at the flying steed, and advanced toward me with a lordly air. "I lay myself at your illustrious feet, Signor," said he in the stately Spanish tongue. "You are my preserver. All I have is yours." The gift was no princely one, for his whole wardrobe would have been purchased for half a crown. His skin was as ingrained with dirt as were his clothes. Beyond a pair of leathern breeches, a ragged shirt, and a cloak, he wore nothing worth mentioning save a tattered sombrero which he held in his hand during our interview. With his evil eyes, his shining teeth, and his long matted hair, he appeared to be anything but a desirable acquaintance. But in no wise conscious of his defects, he rolled a cigarette and straddled impudently before me. A finer specimen of the jail-bird I never beheld, and as I was in no way desirous of continuing the acquaintance, I muttered some acknowledgment of his words and turned to go. This, however, he would not permit. "Do my eyes deceive me," said he, stepping back a pace, "or do I indeed behold the renowned and noble Signor Don Francisco, who honours our city with his magnificent presence?" I admitted the identity, and turned my back upon him as before, but with no better result. "Nay, Signor," said he reproachfully, "you must allow Don Panchito Diaz de Grijalva to pay his debts. I owe you my life. Permit me to save that of your illustrious friend." "What is that you say?" I asked, considerably startled. "Don Enrique is devoted to Lola Tepeaca. Let him beware, lest she give to him the turquoise skull." "That skull again! What do you know about it?" "Everything, your lordship. Was it not I who brought the skull to Lola from the holy hermit Felix, who dwells in yonder mountains? Assuredly it was. Signor, know you not that he who possesses the turquoise skull surely dies?" "How does he die?" "Truly I know not, Signor. It is said that a fiend who slays dwells within the skull. But of the truth of this I know nothing. 4 days was I carrying it from the hills, yet still I am alive." "And Lola, who possesses it? She is alive also." The father of sin does not kill his best soldiers, Don Francisco. The demon who dwells within the skull permits her to live and to work harm. Yet, added Panchito, raising a significant forefinger, 12 has he slain. Beware, Senor, and let not your illustrious friend take the love gift, lest he make the 13th. And with this Panchito took his departure, while I hurried back to the hotel, filled with alarm at the danger hinted at by Fray Benito and the leprero. Both had warned me in words almost identical against the turquoise skull, and although I was not sufficiently superstitious to believe in the existence of this demon, yet the assurance these 12 men had fallen victim to the skull resolved me to warn Harry against accepting it from Lola. But my information had been too late, for when I opened the door there was the turquoise skull on the table, and over it bent my friend. The sight fitted in so dramatically with the stories I had heard that it was impossible to suppress an ejaculation of surprise. Harry looked up and laughed at my staring eyes and open mouth. "Well, old fellow," he said cheerfully, "you look a bit off colour. Have you been sampling the wine of the country?" "Where in the name of heaven did you get that infernal thing?" I stammered. "Oh, this skull? Queer, isn't it? Lola gave it to me." "I guessed as much. Give it back to her at once." "Come now, Frank, don't try me too far. I thought we had settled all that this morning." Dropping into a chair without making a reply, I stared at the blue object on the table. It was a man's skull, completely encrusted with rough turquoises save the cavities of the nose and eyes, which were filled in with Durango rubies. These red and jewelled orbs glittered in so uncanny a fashion as to cause me to suspect the presence of tinfoil. I am fairly self-controlled, but when I remembered how that gruesome skull, with its blue scalp and winking eyes, had caused in some unknown way the death of 12 men, I own that I was unnerved. Shaking and white, I clutched the table, whilst Harry eyed me in angry surprise. "What the deuce is the matter, Frank? This skull—" "Will cause your death. Give it back to Lola." "The sun has been too strong for you," said Harry, with a clouded face. "Go and lie down for an hour." He was about to lift the skull when I sprang up from my chair and dragged him back. "Don't touch it, Harry. Fray Benito says—" "Oh, so that old monk has been gossiping to you about Lola, has he? When I said that you knew him, she told me how he hated her." "Did she mention how this turquoise skull brought about the death of a priest?" "No, nor would I have believed it if she had. How can this dead thing kill any man?" "At all events, it has killed 12. "Fray Benito again." "Yes, and not only he. A lepero I met with but an hour ago spoke with horror of that skull and of its owner." "This is becoming interesting," said Harry, drawing his chair close to mine. "Tell me what they say, Frank." Glad of the opportunity, I recounted the conversations of Fray Benito and the lepero. Harry listened attentively, but made no remark until I had finished. Then he shrugged his shoulders and laughed. "I never heard such nonsense in my life," said he disdainfully. "It is a wonder to me how a sensible man like yourself can swallow such monstrous fables. 12 men killed by that skull. 12 fiddlesticks! It is merely a curious relic of a bygone civilization, the head of some old Aztec or Toltec king embalmed and encrusted with gems. A hermit who knew Lola long before he retired from the world sent it to her as a present." "Then why does she give it to you?" "There is some secret connected with it which she has asked me to discover, if possible. Look here." He handed me a slip of paper, on which were 2 lines written in Spanish. Having a fair knowledge of the language and a capacity for rhyme, I improvised upon them an English couplet: "Find out my secret, and then you shall win Eternal happiness from that within." "In allusion to the beatitude of the victims, no doubt," said I bitterly. "Who is the author of these lines?" "The hermit who sent the skull to Lola," replied Harry, taking back the paper. "She cannot discover the secret, so she has asked me to try." "I trust it will not cost you dear, Harry." "Nonsense! What possible harm can this skull do to me? Look at it. It won't bite you." Taking no heed of his flippancy, I closely examined the bone of contention. The stones were roughly embedded in a kind of cement, and some were missing, while the base was fashioned crudely of unpolished wood. Externally there was no evidence to show that this ghastly object was of a harmful nature, yet so influenced was I by the warnings of the monk and the lepero that I still regarded it with horror. For over an hour I discussed with Harry the advisability of having nothing to do with Lola or her barbarous curiosity, but my efforts were vain, for he obstinately refused to restore the thing to its owner until he had discovered its secret. Wearied out by continuous expostulation, I ceased to argue further, and let him carry it to his bedroom. After all, I might be wrong. I must admit that the stories told by Fray Benito and Don Ponchito were improbable, so that it was not surprising that a prosaic young man such as Harry should despise them. An imaginative strain inherited from Highland ancestors led me to accept with less hesitation these romances of a semi-civilized race. Nevertheless, Harry's scepticism was not without its effect upon me, and I retired to rest, a trifle ashamed of my championship. But in the morning, when I entered his bedroom, the turquoise skull was on the table, and seated before it, fully dressed, was my poor friend, dead. The number of victims was now 13. Part 2. There is no need to dilate upon my profound grief. Harry Carstone had been my closest friend at Oxford as at Eton. Constant companionship had bound us together by no common ties, and his unexpected death fell heavily upon me. I knew that it would fall more heavily still upon the old couple at Carstone Hall. To them I wrote all the details of the death and burial, and then I addressed myself to the task of punishing Lola, whom I regarded as the indirect cause of the tragedy. It is at this point that I assume the principal role. I have mentioned the funeral as having taken place at Zacatecas, for although I wished to have the corpse embalmed for transmission to England, such a course proved to be quite out of the question. Whatever the cause of death was, and I was utterly unable to determine it, the state of the body was such as to necessitate a hasty interment. In 24 hours the remains of my poor friend were committed to the earth, and I returned from the funeral to take the turquoise skull to Lola, and to compel her to confess by what means it had killed Harry. To my surprise, the skull was gone. A senora had come, explained the landlord, and had awaited the return of Don Francisco in the sitting-room. But after a time she had changed her mind and departed. I had no doubt that it was Lola who had visited my hotel for the purpose of recovering the turquoise skull. So long as it remained in her possession I could not hope to solve the mystery of Harry's death, and how to get it back I could not think. That the woman would dare to approach the scene of her crime angered me greatly, and confirmed my determination to remain for retributive justice. In turn, Fray Benito and the lepero commiserated with me, but I took neither into my confidence. The first, a religious recluse, could be of no possible assistance, whilst I more than suspected the other of having an understanding with her whom I designed to punish. Above all, was it important that I should regain possession of this turquoise skull. If I could arrive at the secret hinted at in the couplet, I might succeed in discovering the cause of the 13 deaths, and so bring Lola within the clutches of the law. If legal measures proved unavailing, I intended myself to mete out justice. She had killed Harry, and I would kill her. This savage resolve, entirely foreign to my nature, was the result of the terrible tragedy of the previous week. In some way I was determined to avenge the death of my friend. Informed by Panchito that it was Lola's invariable custom to request her lovers to solve the secret of the skull, I hoped, by becoming one of these, to secure the instrument of her crimes. Ignorant as I was of the way in which the thing accomplished its mission, there was the chance that I too might lose my life. But such a contingency did not deter me from prosecuting my design. With great care I might come off harmless, and even did I not, I hoped before dying to destroy the skull so that its list of victims should terminate with my death. Thus prepared for good or evil, I called upon Lola, whom I found in the garden in a grass hammock with her usual accessories of fan and cigarette. She exhibited no signs of confusion or fear, but with an audacity which revolted me, she openly lamented the death of Harry. An accident, she termed it, as though she did not know full well the hideous truth. "Alas, Signor, that I should have given Don Enrique the turquoise shell," she cried with feigned sorrow, "but I knew not that it would cause his death." "Yet you had experience to go upon, Signora." Lola closed her fan with a snap, and became alive to the situation. "What say you, Don Francisco? Those 12 friends of yours who—" "Who died," said Lola, unfurling her fan with unnecessary violence. "And what of that? Am I responsible for their deaths? Truly, no. Why should I slay those who love me? Oh, yes, Signor, I know well that Fray Benito has been talking. Succuba, sorceress, demon, those are the words ever on his lips when he speaks of me. True enough, that turquoise skull has gained for you no enviable reputation. And therefore it is only a skull, but one that kills. Don Panchito— you know him, that scamp," she interrupted hastily. "He could have prevented all these deaths, for he knows the secret of the skull. I do not. Hence I have asked those who loved me to discover it. They have died, and so I bear the blame. But it is all Panchito's fault." "He procured the skull from Fray Felix, I believe." "Yes, Signor, he has been talking, I see. Tell me," she said curiously, "do you think that a demon dwells within the skull?" "You know best, Signora." "Nay, Don Francisco, you talk foolishly. I am quite in ignorance of the matter. The skull is a dead thing. It cannot slay." "Nevertheless, it does slay." "Ay," she answered with a shrug, "but how, I know not." "Why not destroy it?" "I dare not," said she in a frightened whisper. "It is the head of a dead king. Who knows what curses the dead may send? Nay, I shall not destroy it. All I wish is to discover its secret. But alas, I cannot, and they who to aid me have sought this knowledge have perished." "Let me try, Signora." "Thou, Don Francisco? No, no. 13 have died in the quest. Let there be no more. Think of your poor friend. Ah me, how I have wept at his fate." This affected sorrow and feigned ignorance did not deceive me. I saw that in truth she was overjoyed at my offer, but feared to accept it too readily, lest she might fall into a trap. When I thought of how she had caused Harry's death, I could have slain her then and there. But I determined to punish her in a more deliberate fashion. I therefore persisted in my offer, and after much hesitation she accepted it. Descending to the patio with the skull under my cloak, I heard a low laugh of satisfaction. It was Lola, rejoicing over her success in adding a 14th victim to her list. "To-day to you, to-morrow to me," muttered I to myself. On the way to my hotel I met with Don Panchito. He planted himself in my way, and catching sight of the skull, he touched it significantly with his finger. "Does Lola wish you also to die?" said he. "Give it back, Don Francisco. There is death under those blue stones." "Not if you tell me the secret, Panchito." "Most illustrious Signor, you saved my life, and I would most willingly save yours. But I swear by the Virgin that I know not the secret. Who says so lies." "Then Lola lies." Panchito twirled his cigarette with a contemptuous smile. He had evidently a bad opinion of the lady. "Does she do aught else but lie, your worship? And what says she of the skull?" "Very little, but she asked me to search for a spring which opens it." "Exactly, Signor. She is too wise to search for the spring herself." "There you are wrong. She has done so and failed." The lepero looked at me dubiously. My unaccountable defence of Lola led him to mistake my feelings towards her. "Do you love Lola?" "Nay, Panchito, I abhor the witch. I take this skull to learn its secret. I hope to punish her for slaying my friend." "Good. Did I know the secret, the knowledge would be yours. But you are as wise as I, Senor. Yet this much I can speak. In searching for the spring, should you feel pain or see blood, you die." Before I could demand an explanation, Panchito folded his cloak about him and disappeared. He had a way of coming and going which savoured of magic. On this occasion I resented his unexpected vanishment, for it struck me that he hinted more than he chose to tell. However, his advice was worth taking, and when I unpacked the skull in my sitting-room, I was particularly careful to handle it lightly. The Angelus was ringing before I could persuade myself into attempting the solution of this problem. Before proceeding to an examination, I laid an axe on the table, for if all the other means failed, I was resolved to smash open the skull, and thus roughly end the mystery. Thus prepared, I sat down and gently fingered the turquoise scalp in search of the spring. My sense of touch is unusually delicate, but though I felt line after line of the gemstones, I could find no projecting knob to press. Failing so far, I examined the ruby eyes, the wooden base, and lastly the ruby nose. The gems of this latter were particularly irregular in their setting. Being ambidexter, I held the skull with my right hand, and pressed hard with the forefinger of the left. Suddenly I felt a thrill of pain, and withdrew my finger to see a tiny globule of blood swelling on the tip. In an instant I remembered Panchito's warning. It explained itself. Blood poisoning. That very instant I chopped off my forefinger with the axe before the venom had time to pass the middle joint, and with my maimed hand wrapped in a handkerchief, I raced out of the hotel in search of a doctor. When I returned, white with pain and loss of blood, I found the room occupied. Lola, frowning and surprised, stood looking at the severed finger on the table. She had come to survey my body and to recover the skull. My unexpected entrance caused her to utter an ejaculation, but whether of regret, of wrath, or of surprise merely, I was too perturbed to notice. "You see, I am still alive, Senora, and I know now how my poor friend died. You know also, you infamous creature." "Why did you cut it off?" she stammered, still looking at the severed finger. "To save my life. Else would I now be dead, and you would have taken back your accursed turquoise skull until you invade a new victim within your toils. But this ends it. No more shall die." Before she could guess my intent, I took up the axe and with one stroke cleaved the skull in twain. Lola screamed and hid her face. From the interior of the accursed thing poured a glittering stream of jewels. Diamonds, rubies, sapphires, all kinds of gems, tinkled out onto the table and rapped like small shot onto the floor. The Spanish woman stood aghast at the sight. With a pious exclamation, she stooped to pick them up. "No," I cried, "no, wretch! Look here, not there!" I thrust forward the right hemisphere of the skull, and displayed the wicked mechanism of the interior. A snake's fang, concealed at the back of the nose, curved itself to the surface, and finally emerged between two rubies. At the least pressure, this spike, keen as a thorn, injected venom. This, collected in a small bag, was attached to the root of the fang, so that the poison could trickle drop by drop to the deadly point. Never was there so ingeniously fiendish an invention, and I wondered what devil could have designed it. "Felix!" she gasped, looking white and sick. "He then intended my death. Ah, what mercy that I touched not the evil thing!" "It was a pity you did not," said I savagely, "for then 13 men might be alive still." "I did not know of this, Senor. I swear I did not. Felix loved me and fled to a hermitage because I loved another. He sent me the turquoise skull as a gift, saying that I should find eternal happiness if I succeeded in opening it. I was afraid, Senor. I thought there was danger, and so I touched not the thing, and asked my friends to open it. But you, Don Francisco, have discovered the secret." Ay, at the cost of my friend's life and my own finger. Leave those jewels," I added, as she again bent to pick them up. "They are mine," she cried defiantly. "Felix sent them to me." "He sent you death, not jewels," I retorted, angered at her heartlessness. "Leave them. You shall not take one with you." She looked wrathfully at the floor and then at me. I was determined to punish her for her callousness, but I saw that I should have to resort to strong measures to do so. "Out, you infamous creature, out!" Lola saw the barrel of my revolver pointed at her, and with a gasp of terror she fled from the room. That was the last I saw of her. I took the skull and jewels to Fray Benito and told him my story. He did not evince much astonishment at it. Being a Mexican and a confessor, he was well aware of the devilments of his countrymen. "I knew this Felix," he said gravely. "He was a wild and reckless youth, and he vowed to punish this daughter of sin for her treatment of him. He became a recluse, and while in the mountains he discovered a cave wherein the Aztecs laid their dead chiefs. This is the skull of some mummy, adorned and packed with gems after their barbarous fashion." "But the poisonous fang, Fray?" "No doubt Felix placed it there for his revenge. He judged that the evil woman would take his advice and press the skull to find the supposed spring. One touch of that fang and she would die. But she was too cunning to venture, Don Francisco. From her knowledge of the sender's character, she suspected danger, and so she let others die for her." "And the jewels?" "Felix probably found them in the cave of the dead. They were of no use to him. Doubtless he placed them in the cavity of the skull to embitter the dying moments of her he hated." "I don't understand." "See you, Senor. Felix concluded that Lola Tepeaca would touch the snake tooth and thus open the skull and meet her death at the same time. Knowing her greed, it would be an additional pang for her to see these jewels which she could not live to enjoy." "What a fiendish idea!" "Ay, my son. Human nature is very wicked. Do you intend to keep the jewels?" "No," I answered with a shudder. "They would constantly remind me of my poor friend's death. You can make what use of them you please, father. Yet I shall keep a few with which to reward Panchito, without whose warning I had now been dead." Fray Benito accepted the gift, and now Our Lady of the Star possesses a fine necklace of variegated gems, which is the wonder of all visitors. They would wonder still more did they but know the history attached to it. I could do nothing to punish Lola further than depriving her of the jewels. The Mexican lawyer to whom I submitted the case assured me that the evidence was too indefinite to prove her guilty. On moral grounds she surely merited death, but legally speaking she was as assuredly innocent, so she escaped with her life. I often wonder whether she went to the cave of Felix to cajole him into giving her fresh gems. If she did, I have no doubt he killed her. A man capable of inventing such a death trap as the turquoise skull would not hesitate to do what it had failed to accomplish. Once again I heard of Lola. It was from Don Panchito, who accompanied me to the railway station on the day I left Zacatecas. "It is just as well you are going, Senor," said he significantly. "Lola is wild at the loss of the turquoise skull and its jewels. She asked me to knife you, but I refused. Did you not save my life, and have you not given me precious stones? Still, Senor, others may not feel as I do, and the cursed woman may cause you to lose your life as well as your finger." I quite believed it. A woman who could doom 13 men to death for the gratification of her curiosity would not stick at putting the 14th out of the way. I have often regretted I did not shoot her at our last interview, and so rid the world of a demon. But if she is in existence, the turquoise skull is not. Neither is the forefinger of my left hand. End of Story 4. Story 5 of The Dwarf's Chamber and Other Stories by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 5, The Green Stone God and the Stockbroker. As a rule, the average detective gets twice the credit he deserves. I am not talking of the novelist's miracle monger, but of the flesh and blood reality, who is liable to err, and who frequently proves such liability. You can take it as certain that a detective who sets down a clean run and no hitch as entirely due to his astucity is young in years and still younger in experience. Older men, who have been bamboozled 100 times by the craft of criminality, recognize the influence of chance to make or mar. There you have it. 9 times out of 10, chance does more in clinching a case than all the dexterity and mother wit of the man in charge. The exception must be engineered by an infallible apostle. Such a one is unknown to me, out of print. This opinion, based rather on collective experience than on any one episode, can be substantiated by several incontrovertible facts. In this instance, one will suffice. Therefore, I take the Brixton case to illustrate chance as a factor in human affairs. Had it not been for that Maori fetish, but such rather ends than begins the story, therefore it were wise to dismiss it for the moment. Yet that piece of greenstone hanged a person mentioned hereafter. When Mr. and Mrs. Paul Vincent set up housekeeping at Ulster Lodge, they were regarded as decided acquisitions to Brixton society. She, pretty and musical; he, smart in looks, moderately well off, and an excellent tennis player. Their progenitors, his father and her mother, both since deceased, had lived a life of undoubted middle-class respectability. The halo thereof still environed their children, who were, in consequence of such inherited grace and their own individualisms, much sought out by genteel Brixtonians. Moreover, this popular couple were devoted to each other, and even after 3 years of marriage they posed still as lovers. This was as it should be, and by admiring friends and relations the Vincents were regarded as paragons of matrimonial perfection. Vincent was a stockbroker, therefore he passed most of his time in the city. Judge, then, of the commotion when pretty Mrs. Vincent was discovered in the study, stabbed to the heart. So aimless a crime were scarce imaginable. She had many friends, no known enemies, yet she came to this tragic end. Closer examination revealed that the escritoire had been broken into, and Mr. Vincent declared himself the poorer by £200. Primarily, therefore, robbery was the sole object, but by reason of Mrs. Vincent's interference, the thief had been converted into a murderer. So excellently had the assassin chosen his time, that such choice argued a close acquaintance with the domestic economy of Ulster Lodge. The husband was detained in town till midnight. The servants, cook and housemaid, on leave to attend wedding festivities, were absent till 11 o'clock. Mrs. Vincent, therefore, was absolutely alone in the house for 6 hours, during which period the crime had been committed. The servants discovered the body of their unfortunate mistress, and raised the alarm at once. Later on Vincent arrived to find his wife dead, his house in possession of the police, and the 2 servants in hysterics. For that night nothing could be done. But at dawn a move was made towards elucidating the mystery. At this point I came into the story. Instructed at 9 o'clock to take charge of the case, by 10 I was on the spot, noting details and collecting evidence. Beyond removal of the body nothing had been disturbed, and the study was in precisely the same condition as when the crime was discovered. I examined carefully the apartment, and afterwards interrogated the cook, the housemaid, and lastly the master of the house. The result gave me slight hope of securing the assassin. The room, a fair-sized one looking out on to a lawn between house and road, was furnished in cheap bachelor fashion. An old-fashioned desk placed at right angles to the window, a round table reaching nigh the sill, 2 armchairs, 3 of the ordinary cane-seated kind, and on the mantelpiece an arrangement of pipes, pistols, boxing gloves, and foils. One of these latter was missing. A single glimpse showed how terrible a struggle had taken place before the murderer had overpowered his victim. The tablecloth lay disorderly on the floor, two of the lighter chairs were overturned, and the desk, with several drawers open, was hacked about considerably. No key was in the door lock, which faced the escritoire, and the window snick was fastened securely. Further search resulted in the following discoveries. 1. A hatchet used for chopping wood, found near the desk. 2. A foil with the button broken off, lying under the table. 3. A greenstone idol, edged under the fender. The cook, defiantly courageous by reason of brandy, declared that she had left the house at 4 o'clock on the previous day, and had returned close on 11. The back door, to her surprise, was open. With the housemaid she went to inform her mistress of this fact, and found the body lying midway between door and fireplace. At once she called in the police. Her master and mistress were a most attached couple, and, so far as she knew, they had no enemies. Similar evidence was obtained from the housemaid, with the additional information that the hatchet belonged to the woodshed. The other rooms were undisturbed. Poor young Vincent was so broken down by the tragedy that he could hardly answer my questions with calmness. Sympathizing with his natural grief, I interrogated him as delicately as was possible, and I am bound to admit that he replied with remarkable promptitude and clearness. "What do you know of this unhappy affair?" I asked, when we were alone in the drawing-room. He refused to stay in the study, as was surely natural under the circumstances. "Absolutely nothing," he replied. "I went to the city yesterday at 10 in the morning, and as I had business to do, I wired my wife I would not return till midnight. She was full of health and spirits when I last saw her, but now—" Incapable of further speech, he made a gesture of despair. Then, after a pause, he added, "Have you any theory on the subject?" "Judging from the wrecked condition of the desk, I should say robbery." "Robbery?" he interrupted, changing colour. "Yes, that was the motive. I had £200 locked up in the desk." "In gold or notes?" "The latter, 450s, Bank of England." "You are sure they are missing?" "Yes. The drawer in which they were placed is smashed to pieces." "Did any one know you had placed £200 therein?" "No, save my wife, and yet—" "Ah!" he said, breaking off abruptly. "That is impossible." "What is impossible?" "I will tell you when I hear your theory." "You got that notion out of the novels of the shilling sort," I answered dryly. "Every detective doesn't theorize on the instant. I haven't any particular theory that I know of. Whoever committed this crime must have known your wife was alone in the house, and that there was £200 locked up in the desk. Did you mention these two facts to any one?" Vincent pulled his moustache in some embarrassment. I guessed by the action that he had been indiscreet. "I don't wish to get an innocent person into trouble," he said at length, "but I did mention it to a man called Roy." "For what reason?" "It is a bit of a story. I lost 200 to a friend at cards, and drew 450s to pay him. He went out of town, so I locked up the money in my desk for safety. Last night Roy came to me at the club, much agitated, and asked me to loan him 100. Said it meant ruin else. I offered him a cheque, but he wanted cash. I then told him I had left 200 at home, so at the moment I could not lay my hand on it. He asked if he could not go to Brixton for it, but I said the house was empty and—" "But it wasn't empty," I interrupted. "I believed it would be. I knew the servants were going to the wedding, and I thought my wife, instead of spending a lonely evening, would call on some friend." "Well, and after you told Roy that the house was empty? He went away, looking awfully cut up, and swore he must have the money at any price. But it was quite impossible he could have anything to do with this." "I don't know. You told him where the money was, and that the house was unprotected, as you thought. What was more probable than that he should have come down with the intention of stealing the money? If so, what follows? Entering by the back door, he takes the hatchet from the woodshed to open the desk. Your wife, hearing a noise, discovers him in the study. In a state of frenzy, he snatches a foil from the mantelpiece and kills her, then decamps with the money. There is your theory, and a mighty bad one — for Roy." "You don't intend to arrest him?" asked Vincent quickly. "Not on insufficient evidence. If he committed the crime and stole the money, it is certain that, sooner or later, he will change the notes. Now, if I had the numbers—" "Here are the numbers," said Vincent, producing his pocket-book. "I always take the numbers of such large notes. But surely," he added, as I copied them down, "surely you don't think Roy guilty?" "I don't know. I should like to know his movements on that night." "I cannot tell you. He saw me at the Chestnut Club about 7 o'clock, and left immediately afterwards. I kept my business appointment, went to the Alhambra, and then returned home." "Give me Roy's address, and describe his personal appearance." "He is a medical student, and lodges at No. Gower Street. Tall, fair-haired, a good-looking young fellow." "And his dress last night?" "He wore evening dress, concealed by a fawn-coloured overcoat." I duly noted these particulars, and I was about to take my leave when I recollected the green stone idol. It was so strange an object to find in prosaic Brixton that I could not help thinking it must have come there by accident. "By the way, Mr. Vincent," said I, producing the monstrosity, "is this green stone god your property?" "I never saw it before," replied he, taking it in his hands. "Is it ah!" he added, dropping the idol, "there is blood on it." "'Tis the blood of your wife, sir. If it does not belong to you, it does to the murderer. From the position in which this was found, I fancy it slipped out of his breast pocket as he stood over his victim. As you see, it is stained with blood. He must have lost his presence of mind, else he would not have left behind so damning a piece of evidence. This idol, sir, will hang the assassin of Mrs. Vincent." "I hope so, but unless you are sure of Roy, do not mar his life by accusing him of this crime." "I certainly should not arrest him without sufficient proof," I answered promptly, and so took my departure. Vincent showed up very well in this preliminary conversation. Much as he desired to punish the criminal, yet he was unwilling to subject Roy to possibly unfounded suspicions. Had I not forced the club episode out of him, I doubt whether he would have told it. As it was, the information gave me the necessary clue. Roy alone knew that the notes were in the escritoire, and imagined, owing to the mistake of Vincent, that the house was empty. Determined to have the money at any price, his own words, he intended but robbery, till the unexpected appearance of Mrs. Vincent merged the lesser in the greater crime. My first step was to advise the bank that 4 50-pound notes, numbered so and so, were stolen, and that the thief or his deputy would probably change them within a reasonable period. I did not say a word about the crime, and kept all special details out of the newspapers, for as the murderer would probably read up the reports so as to shape his course by the action of the police, I judged it wiser that he should know as little as possible. Those minute press notices do more harm than good. They gratify the morbid appetite of the public, and put the criminal on his guard. Thereby the police work in the dark. But he, thanks to the posting up of special reporters, knows the doings of the law, and baffles it accordingly. The greenstone idol worried me considerably. I wanted to know how it had got into the study of Ulster Lodge. When I knew that, I could nail my man. But there was considerable difficulty to overcome before such knowledge was available. Now, a curiosity of this kind is not a common object in this country. A man who owns one must have come from New Zealand, or have obtained it from a New Zealand friend. He could not have picked it up in London. If he did, he would not carry it constantly about with him. It was therefore my idea that the murderer had received the idol from a friend on the day of the crime. That friend, to possess such an idol, must have been in communication with New Zealand. The chain of thought is somewhat complicated, but it began with curiosity about the idol, and ended in my looking up the list of steamers going to the Antipodes. Then I carried out a little design which need not be mentioned at this moment. In due time it will fit in with the hanging of Mrs. Vincent's assassin. Meanwhile I followed up the clue of the bank notes, and left the greenstone idol to evolve its own destiny. Thus I had two strings in my bow. The crime was committed on the 20th of June, and on the 23rd 2 £50 notes with numbers corresponding to those stolen were paid into the Bank of England. I was astonished at the little care exercised by the criminal in concealing his crime, but still more so when I learned that the money had been banked by a very respectable solicitor. Furnished with the address, I called on this gentleman. Mr. Maudsley received me politely, and he had no hesitation in telling me how the notes had come into his possession. I did not state my primary reason for the inquiry. "I hope there is no trouble about these notes," said he, when I explained my errand. "I have had sufficient already." "Indeed, Mr. Maudsley, and in what way?" For answer he touched the bell, and when it was answered, "Ask Mr. Ford to step this way," he said. Then turning to me, "I must reveal what I had hoped to keep secret, but I trust the revelation will remain with yourself." "That is as I may decide after hearing it. I am a detective, Mr. Maudsley, and you may be sure I do not make these inquiries out of idle curiosity." Before he could reply, a slender, weak-looking young man, nervously excited, entered the room. This was Mr. Ford, and he looked from me to Maudsley with some apprehension. "This gentleman," said his employer, not unkindly, "comes from Scotland Yard about the money you paid me 2 days ago." "It is all right, I hope," stammered Ford, turning red and pale and red again. "Where did you get the money?" I asked, parrying this question. "From my sister." I started when I heard this answer, and with good reason. My inquiries about Roy had revealed that he was in love with a hospital nurse whose name was Clara Ford. Without doubt she had obtained the notes from Roy after he had stolen them from Ulster Lodge. But why the necessity of the robbery? "Why did you get £100 from your sister?" I asked Ford. He did not answer, but looked appealingly at Maudsley. That gentleman interposed. "We must make a clean breast of it, Ford," he said, with a sigh. "If you have committed a second crime to conceal the first, I cannot help you. This time matters are not at my discretion." "I have committed no crime," said Ford desperately, turning to me. "Sir, I may as well admit that I embezzled £100 from Mr. Maudsley to pay a gambling debt. He kindly and most generously consented to overlook the delinquency if I replaced the money. Not having it myself, I asked my sister. She, a poor hospital nurse, had not the amount. Yet, as non-payment meant ruin to me, she asked a Mr. Julian Roy to help her. He at once agreed to do so, and gave her 2 £50 notes. She handed them to me, and I gave them to Mr. Maudsley, who paid them into the bank." This, then, was the reason of Roy's remark. He did not refer to his own ruin, but to that of Ford. To save this unhappy man, and for love of the sister, he had committed the crime. I did not need to see Clara Ford, but at once made up my mind to arrest Roy. The case was perfectly clear, and I was fully justified in taking this course. Meanwhile, I made Maudsley and his clerk promise silence, as I did not wish Roy to be put on his guard by Miss Ford through her brother. "Gentlemen," I said, after a few moments' pause, "I cannot at present explain my reasons for asking these questions, as it would take too long, and I have no time to lose. Keep silent about this interview until to-morrow, and by that time you shall know all." "Has Ford got into fresh trouble?" asked Maudsley anxiously. "No, but someone else has." "My sister," began Ford faintly, when I interrupted him at once. "Your sister is all right, Mr. Ford. Pray trust in my discretion. No harm shall come to her or to you, if I can help it. But above all, be silent." This they readily promised, and I returned to Scotland Yard, quite satisfied that Roy would get no warning. The evidence was so clear that I could not doubt the guilt of Roy. Else how had he come in possession of the notes? Already there was sufficient proof to hang him, yet I'd hoped to clinch the certainty by proving his ownership of the green stone idol. It did not belong to Vincent or to his dead wife, yet some one must have brought it into the study. Why not Roy, who to all appearances had committed the crime, the more so as the image was splashed with the victim's blood? There was no difficulty in obtaining a warrant, and with this I went off to Gower Street. Roy loudly protested his innocence. He denied all knowledge of the crime and of the idol. I expected the denial, but I was astonished at the defence he put forth. It was very ingenious, but so manifestly absurd that it did not shake my belief in his guilt. I let him talk himself out, which perhaps was wrong, but he would not be silent, and then I took him off in a cab. "I swear I did not commit the crime," he said, passionately. "No one was more astonished than I at the news of Mrs. Vincent's death." "Yet you were at Ulster Lodge on the night in question." "I admit it," he replied frankly. "Were I guilty I would not do so. But I was there at the request of Vincent." "I must remind you that all you say now will be used in evidence against you." "I don't care. I must defend myself. I asked Vincent for £100, and—" "Of course you did, to give to Miss Ford." "How do you know that?" he asked sharply. "From her brother, through Maudsley. He paid the notes supplied by you into the bank. If you wanted to conceal your crime, you should not have been so reckless." "I have committed no crime," retorted Roy fiercely. "I obtained the money from Vincent at the request of Miss Ford, to save her brother from being convicted for embezzlement." "Vincent denies that he gave you the money." "Then he lies. I asked him at the Chestnut Club for £100. He had not that much on him, but said that 200 were in his desk at home. As it was imperative that I should have the money on the night, I asked him to let me go down for it." "And he refused?" "He did not. He consented, and gave me a note to Mrs. Vincent, instructing her to hand me over £100. I went to Brixton, got the money in 250s, and gave them to Miss Ford. When I left Ulster Lodge between 8 and 9, Mrs. Vincent was in perfect health and quite happy." "An ingenious defence," said I doubtfully, "but Vincent absolutely denies that he gave you the money." Roy stared hard at me to see if I was joking. Evidently the attitude of Vincent puzzled him greatly. "That is ridiculous," said he quietly. "He wrote a note to his wife instructing her to hand me the money." "Where is that note?" "I gave it to Mrs. Vincent." "It cannot be found," I answered. "If such a note were in her possession it would now be in mine." "Don't you believe me?" "How can I, against the evidence of those notes and the denial of Vincent?" "But he surely does not deny that he gave me the money." "He does." "He must be mad," said Roy in dismay. "One of my best friends, and to tell so great a falsehood. Why, if—" "You had better be silent," I said, weary of this foolish talk. "If what you say is true, Vincent will exonerate you from complicity in the crime. If things occurred as you say, there is no sense in his denial." This latter remark was made to stop the torrent of his speech. It was not my business to listen to incriminating declarations or to ingenious defences. All that sort of thing is for judge and jury. Therefore I ended the conversation as above, and marched off my prisoner. Whether the birds of the air carry news I do not know, but they must have been busy on this occasion, for next morning every newspaper in London was congratulating me on my clever capture of the supposed murderer. Some detectives would have been gratified by this public laudation. I was not. Roy's passionate protestations of innocence made me feel uneasy, and I doubted whether, after all, I had the right man under lock and key. Yet the evidence was strong against him. He admitted having been with Mrs. Vincent on the fatal night. He admitted possession of two £50 notes. His only defence was the letter of the stockbroker, and this was missing, if indeed it had ever been written. Vincent was terribly upset by the arrest of Roy. He liked the young man, and he had believed in his innocence so far as was possible. But in the face of such strong evidence he was forced to believe him guilty. Yet he blamed himself severely that he had not lent the money, and so averted the catastrophe. "I had no idea that the matter was of such moment," he said to me, "else I would have gone down to Brixton myself and have given him the money. Then his frenzy would have spared my wife, and himself a death on the scaffold. What do you think of his defence?" "It is wholly untrue. I did not write a note, nor did I tell him to go to Brixton. Why should I, when I fully believed no one was in the house?" "It was a pity you did not go home, Mr. Vincent, instead of to the Alhambra." "It was a mistake," he assented, "but I had no idea Roy would attempt the robbery. Besides, I was under engagement to go to the theatre with my friend, Dr. Monson." "Do you think that idol belongs to Roy?" "I can't say. I never saw it in his possession." "Why?" "Because I firmly believe that if Roy had not the idol in his pocket on that fatal night, he is innocent." "Oh, you look astonished, but the man who murdered your wife owns that idol." The morning after this conversation a lady called at Scotland Yard and asked to see me concerning the Brixton case. Fortunately I was then in the neighbourhood, and, guessing who she was, I afforded her the interview she sought. When all left the room she raised her veil, and I saw before me a noble-looking woman, somewhat resembling Mr. Maudsley's clerk. Yet, by some contradiction of nature, her face was the more virile of the two. "You are Miss Ford," I said, guessing her identity. "I am Clara Ford," she answered quietly. "I have come to see you about Mr. Roy." "I am afraid nothing can be done to save him." "Something must be done," she said passionately. "We are engaged to be married, and all a woman can do to save her lover I will do. Do you believe him to be guilty?" "In the face of such evidence, Miss Ford." "I don't care what evidence is against him," she retorted. "He is as innocent of the crime as I am. Do you think that a man fresh from the committal of a crime would place the money won by that crime in the hands of the woman he professes to love? I tell you he is innocent." "Mr. Vincent doesn't think so." "Mr. Vincent!" said Miss Ford with a scornful emphasis. "Oh, yes. I quite believe he would think Julian guilty." "Surely not, if it were possible to think otherwise. He is, or rather was, a staunch friend to Mr. Roy." "So staunch that he tried to break off the match between us. Listen to me, sir." "I have told no one before, but I tell you now. Mr. Vincent is a villain. He pretended to be the friend of Julian, and yet he dared to make proposals to me, dishonourable proposals, for which I could have struck him. He, a married man, a pretended friend, wished me to leave Julian and fly with him." "Surely you are mistaken, Miss Ford. Mr. Vincent was most devoted to his wife." "He did not care at all for his wife," she replied steadily. "He was in love with me. To save Julian annoyance, I did not tell him of the insults offered to me by Mr. Vincent. Now that Julian is in trouble by an unfortunate mistake, Mr. Vincent is delighted." "It is impossible. I assure you Vincent is very sorry to—" "You do not believe me," she said, interrupting. "Very well. I shall give you proof of the truth. Come to my brother's rooms at Bloomsbury. I shall send for Mr. Vincent, and if you are concealed you shall hear from his own lips how glad he is that my lover and his wife are removed from the path of his dishonourable passion." "I will come, Miss Ford, but I think you are mistaken in Vincent." "You shall see," she replied coldly. Then, with a sudden change of tone, "Is there no way of saving Julian? I am sure that he is innocent. Appearances are against him, but it was not he who committed the crime. Is there no way, no way?" Moved by her earnest appeal, I produced the greenstone idol, and told her all I had done in connection with it. She listened eagerly, and readily grasped at the hope thus held out to her of saving Roy. When in possession of all the facts, she considered in silence for some 2 minutes. At the end of that time she drew down her veil and prepared to take her departure. "Come to my brother's rooms in Alfred Place, near Tottenham Court Road," said she, holding out her hand. "I promise you that there you shall see Mr. Vincent in his true character. Good bye till Monday at 3 o'clock." From the colour of her face and the bright light in her eye, I guessed that she had some scheme in her head for the saving of Roy. I think myself clever, but after that interview at Alfred's place, I declare I am but a fool compared to this woman. She put two and two together, ferreted out unguessed of evidence, and finally produced the most wonderful result. When she left me, at this moment, the greenstone idol was in her pocket. With that she hoped to prove the innocence of her lover, and the guilt of another person. It was the cleverest thing I ever saw in my life. The inquest on the body of Mrs. Vincent resulted in a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown. Then she was buried, and all London waited for the trial of Roy. He was brought up, charged with the crime, reserved his defence, and in due course he was committed for trial. Meantime I called on Miss Ford at the appointed time, and found her alone. "Mr. Vincent will be here shortly," she said calmly. "I see Julian is committed for trial." "And he has reserved his defence." "I shall defend him," said she, with a strange look in her face. "I am not afraid for him now. He saved my unhappy brother. I shall save him." "Have you discovered anything?" "I have discovered a good deal. Hush! That is Mr. Vincent," she added as a cab drew up to the door. "Hide yourself behind this curtain, and do not appear until I give you the signal." Wondering what she was about to do, I concealed myself as directed. The next moment Vincent was in the room, and then ensued one of the strangest of scenes. She received him coldly, and motioned him to a seat. Vincent was nervous, but she might have been a stone, so little emotion did she display. "I have sent for you, Mr. Vincent," she said, "to ask for your help in releasing Julian." "How can I help you?" he answered in amazement. "Willingly would I do so, but it is out of my power." "I don't think it is." "I assure you, Clara," he began eagerly, when she cut him short. "Yes, call me Clara. Say that you love me. Lie like all men, and yet refuse to do what I wish." "I am not going to help Julian to marry you," declared he sullenly. "You know that I love you. I love you dearly. I wish to marry you. Is not that declaration rather soon after the death of your wife?" "My wife is gone, poor soul. Let her rest." "Yet you loved her?" "I never loved her," he said, rising to his feet. "I love you. From the first moment I saw you, I loved you. My wife is dead. Julian Roy is in prison on a charge of murdering her. With these obstacles removed, there is no reason why we should not marry." "If I marry you," she said slowly, "will you help Julian to refute this charge?" "I cannot. The evidence is too strong against him." "You know that he is innocent, Mr. Vincent." "I do not. I believe that he murdered my wife." "You believe that he murdered your wife," she reiterated, coming a step closer and holding out the greenstone idol. "Do you believe that he dropped this in the study when his hand struck the fatal blow?" "I don't know," he said coolly, glancing at the idol. "I never saw it before." "Think again, Mr. Vincent, think again. Who was it that went to the Alhambra at 8 o'clock with Dr. Monson, and met there the captain of a New Zealand steamer with whom he was acquainted?" "It was I," said Vincent defiantly. "And what of that?" "This," she said in a loud voice. "This captain gave you the greenstone idol at the Alhambra, and you placed it in your breast pocket. Shortly afterwards you followed to Brixton the man whose death you had plotted. You repaired to your house, killed your unhappy wife, who received you in all innocence, took the balance of the money, hacked the desk, and then dropped by accident this idol which convicts you of the crime." During this speech she advanced step by step towards the wretched man, who, pale and anguished, retreated before her fury. He came right to my hiding-place and almost fell into my arms. I had heard enough to convince me of his guilt, and the next moment I was struggling with him. "It is a lie," he said hoarsely, trying to escape. "It is true," said I, pinning him down. "From my soul I believe you to be guilty." During the fight his pocket-book fell on the floor, and the papers therein were scattered. Miss Ford picked up one spotted with blood. "The proof," she said, holding it before us, "the proof that Julian spoke the truth. There is the letter written by you which authorized your unhappy wife to give him £100. Vincent saw that all was against him, and gave in without further struggle, like the craven he was. "Fate is too strong for me," he said, when I snapped the handcuffs on his wrists. "I admit the crime. It was for love of you that I did it. I hated my wife, who was a drag on me, and I hated Roy, who loved you. In one sweep I thought to rid myself of both. His application for the money put the chance into my hand. I went to Brixton, found that my wife had given the money as directed, and then I killed her with the foil snatched from the wall, smashed the desk and overturned the chair, to favour an idea of the robbery, and then I left the house. Driving to a higher station than Brixton, I caught a train and was speedily back at the Alhambra. Monson never suspected my absence, thinking I was in a different corner of the house. I had thus an alibi ready. Had it not been for that letter, which I was fool enough to keep, and that infernal idol that dropped out of my pocket, I should have hanged Roy and married you. As it turns out, the idol has betrayed me. And now, sir," he added, turning to me, "you had better take me to gaol." I did so there and then. After the legal formalities were gone through, Julian Roy was released, and ultimately married Miss Ford. Vincent was hanged, as he well deserved to be for so cowardly a crime. My reward was the greenstone god, which I keep as a memento of a very curious case. Some weeks later Miss Ford told me the way in which she had laid the trap. "When you revealed your suspicions about the idol," she said, "I was convinced that Vincent had something to do with the crime. You mentioned Dr. Monson as having been with him at the Alhambra. He is one of the doctors at the hospital in which I am employed. I asked him about the idol and showed it to him. He remembered it being given to Vincent by the captain of the Kaitangata. The curious look of the thing had impressed itself on his memory. On hearing this, I went to the docks and I saw the captain. He recognized the idol and remembered giving it to Vincent. From what you told me, I guessed the way in which the plot had been carried out, so I spoke to Vincent as you heard. Most of it was guesswork, and only when I saw that letter was I absolutely sure of his guilt. It was due to the greenstone god." "So I think, but to chance also. But for the accident of the idol dropping out of Vincent's pocket, Roy would have been hanged for a crime of which he was innocent. Therefore do I say that in 9 cases out of 10, chance does more to clinch a case than all the dexterity of the man in charge. End of Story 5